In the quiet shadows of history, Meyer Lansky built an empire with blood and betrayal, his genius hidden behind a mask of silence. But as his legacy fades, the question remains, what price did he truly pay for the power he wielded, and who was left to count the cost? Meyer Lansky's story began not in the world of glitz and glamour, but in the tight, suffocating alleys of a poor, crowded town in Eastern Europe. It was a place where hardship clung to you like the cold, a place where Jews were treated as nothing more than burdens to be borne. Born in 1902, in a village on the fringes of what was then the Russian Empire, Lansky's early years were defined by fear of poverty, fear of persecution, and the ever-present shadow of violence. He lived in a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, and every day was a battle to stay one step ahead of fate. The family was poor, struggling to make ends meet, and Meyer's father, a tailor, wasn't immune to the brutality of the times. Anti-Semitic riots were frequent, and the streets were often filled with the echoes of violence, making the world seem like a constant war zone. It's in these formative years that Lansky learned his first valuable lesson. The world owed you nothing, and if you wanted to thrive, you had to learn to work with the tools at hand, even if they were dirty. When Meyer was still a child, his family made the decision to leave. The promise of America, with its supposed riches and opportunities, was enough to lure them across an ocean of uncertainty. So they left behind their crumbling homes and boarded a ship, bound for a new life. Though they could scarcely imagine the horrors of the journey ahead, the trip to America was long, grueling, and packed with disease. The same ship that carried them toward a new beginning also carried the ghosts of others who hadn't been so lucky. Sickness was rampant, and the stench of illness filled the air. But they survived, and after what seemed like an eternity, they finally docked in New York City. The year was 1911, and the city was alive with a chaotic energy, its streets teeming with the hopes and dreams of millions. But it was not the land of gold Meyer had been promised. The reality was much grimmer. New York, with its overcrowded tenements and suffocating air, was a far cry from the American dream that had been sold to his parents. It was hard work, scraping by, and watching their hopes slowly fade into a bitter reality. But Meyer, even at such a young age, saw something that most people didn't. He saw opportunities in the cracks of society, saw how the system could be bent, how the law could be bent. He wasn't interested in simply surviving, he wanted to thrive. He began to learn how to hustle, how to play the game that was stacked against him. It was here, in the bustling streets of New York, that the man who would one day become Meyer Lansky, one of the most feared and respected mobsters in history, was born. But his rise wasn't just a matter of luck. It was the result of a childhood forged in hardship, where every step forward felt like a victory in a war that had no end. Meyer Lansky's new life in New York was nothing like the one he had imagined. The promise of freedom and opportunity was smothered by the suffocating reality of the Lower East Side, a grim neighborhood where survival meant outsmarting, outrunning, and outlasting. The tenements were cramped, the streets were filthy, and the air was thick with the odor of sweat and ambition. The poor didn't live, they fought to survive, scraping together whatever they could just to make it to the next day. Meyer, barely a teenager, quickly learned that the world didn't care about your dreams. There were no handouts here. His family, just another among thousands of others, found itself battling not just for food but for dignity. And it was here, in these harsh conditions, that Lansky's mind began to sharpen, not on books or schoolwork, but on numbers, deals, and the rhythms of the street. The gangs were the pulse of the neighborhood, an ever-present force in the background of life. They ran the alleys, controlled the goods, and dictated who could and couldn't thrive. But it wasn't just brute force that kept them in power. It was the system of rules they'd crafted, an unspoken code that Lansky quickly learned to respect. If you wanted to survive here, you had to understand the system, how it worked, who could be trusted, and where the real power lay. At first, Meyer simply watched. He watched the older boys, the ones with sharp eyes and slick moves, as they worked their corners and hustled through the crowded streets. He watched them make money by selling everything from cigarettes to stolen goods, their hands quick and their mouths faster. But Meyer wasn't content to stay in the shadows. Even as a young kid, his sharp mind was already picking up patterns, calculating odds, weighing risks against rewards. He saw what they didn't, the cracks in the system, the opportunities the others missed. By the time he was 13, he was running small schemes himself. Nothing big at first, just petty cons, short cons, and whatever else he could do to stay a step ahead. But his early success didn't come without its share of bruises. He quickly learned that in the streets, trust was a luxury few could afford, and loyalty was earned not with words, but with actions. He made his first few enemies, those who felt threatened by a kid who could talk his way out of anything and saw through every lie. But Lansky didn't back down. He adapted. It wasn't long before Meyer became known for something more than just his sharp wit. People began to realize that the kid who seemed quiet and mild-mannered was actually the one who could keep the books, who could launder the money, who could turn a pile of nothing into something worth keeping. Lansky's world was the world of numbers, calculations, and high-stakes risk, an empire built not on muscle, but on strategy. And in a place like the Lower East Side, that was worth more than gold. Meyer Lansky wasn't like the other boys on the streets. While most of them were looking for the next hustle or how to gain respect with their fists, Meyer's mind was constantly working in the background, calculating and measuring everything he saw. It wasn't just that he had an aptitude for numbers, it was that he saw the world through a lens of profit and loss, risk and reward. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where others saw opportunity and quick scores, Meyer saw long-term strategy. He wasn't drawn to the violent, flashy side of street life. He had no interest in being a tough guy, someone whose name was whispered in fear. What fascinated him was the hidden world, the one behind the scenes, the one that allowed the tough guys to get rich without putting their hands in the blood. It was the kind of world that operated in the shadows, where money wasn't made with muscle, but with a sharp mind and careful calculations. By his early teens, Meyer had already figured out that money was the key to everything. The hustle wasn't just about physical strength. It was about knowing how to move numbers, how to hide what was earned, and how to ensure that, when the time came, you had more than just a pile of cash, you had a system. That's when he started thinking of himself not as a street kid, but as a businessman. He began to keep track of his own operations, small at first, just petty schemes and minor hustles. But each move he made, he recorded it, kept an account, making sure that every penny was counted, every cost calculated. It wasn't long before others noticed. They began to call him the accountant, a title that both amused and suited him. Meyer was more than just someone who could handle the numbers. He could see the future, forecast the risks, and navigate the labyrinth of the criminal world in a way that few could. As his reputation grew, so did his opportunities. He started to work with men like Charles, Lucky, Luciano, and other powerful figures, becoming indispensable in ways that went beyond simple bookkeeping. He wasn't just managing their money, he was orchestrating it. He became the unseen hand that guided their fortunes, the one who could make a dollar stretch, hide a transaction, or shift funds from one pocket to another without anyone noticing. In the dark, smoke-filled rooms where deals were made, Meyer's mind was the sharpest weapon. He understood the delicate dance of criminal finances, how to launder money, how to protect profits, how to make the invisible flow of cash work for you. While the rest of the world focused on power and territory, Meyer was building a different kind of empire, one where the numbers told the story. And in this world, he was king. It wasn't long before Meyer Lansky found himself in a room with men who could make or break empires. Men who didn't just control the streets, they controlled the future. The meeting with Charles "Lucky" Luciano was inevitable, though Meyer didn't realize it at the time. They were both rising figures in the underworld, each carving their own path, but their paths had yet to cross. Meyer, with his meticulous mind for numbers, and Luciano, with his ruthless vision for power, were two forces on a collision course. When they finally sat down, it wasn't some grand negotiation, it was a quiet exchange that would shape the course of organized crime in America. Lucky Luciano was already well on his way to becoming a legend. His reputation for being cold, calculated, and ambitious was already cemented in the criminal world. He had dreams bigger than any gangster in history, and he wasn't interested in the old ways of doing business. Luciano was looking to modernize the mafia, streamline its operations, and, most importantly, consolidate power. In his eyes, Meyer was the key. While others focused on muscle and intimidation, Luciano saw in Meyer a man who understood the importance of infrastructure, the importance of making the money move, not just the men. Meyer wasn't intimidated by Luciano's reputation. He'd learned long ago that power wasn't just about who could shout the loudest or pull the trigger first. It was about who controlled the flow of money. And Luciano needed someone who could handle that part, someone who could build an empire that wasn't just based on fear, but on precision and stability. That's where Meyer came in. The meeting between the two men was simple. There was no grand offer, no flashy promises, just the cold, straightforward exchange of ideas. Luciano spoke about his vision for a national crime syndicate, an organized operation that could rival any legitimate business in America. Meyer, always the cautious strategist, listened carefully, sizing up the risk. He knew the stakes were high, but so were the rewards. Luciano wasn't asking for loyalty out of fear. He was asking for loyalty because he understood that, together, they could build something lasting. The partnership was formed in that moment, an alliance that would forever change the landscape of organized crime. Meyer was more than just the numbers guy now. He was a partner in something that could reshape the underworld. Luciano's plan was bold, ambitious, and risky. But with Meyer by his side, the risk seemed a little smaller. Together, they would bring the mafia into the modern world, creating a force so powerful, so far-reaching, that even the government would tremble in its shadow. It was the beginning of a new era for organized crime, one where brains and brawn worked in tandem to control not just the streets, but the future itself. Meyer Lansky's entry into the criminal underworld wasn't dramatic, nor was it marked by some life-altering event. It was quieter than that, a gradual sinking into the world where the rules were unwritten, and loyalty was forged not in words, but in action. His first lessons came not from books or lectures, but from the hustle of the streets themselves. He learned quickly that in this world, survival meant adaptability, and there was no room for weakness. Every scam, every game of chance, every crooked deal was a step further into the abyss. Lansky's first taste of the business came through gambling, an industry where the house always won, but only if it knew how to play the game. He wasn't initially interested in the flashy allure of high-stakes poker games or lavish casinos. No, Meyer was more intrigued by the systems beneath them, the silent mechanics that ensured the deck was stacked in favor of the right players. He started small, hanging around the street corner craps games, where hustlers took turns rolling dice for small bets. It was there that he picked up his first lesson. In gambling, like in life, the game was rigged. But if you knew the rules, you could always walk away with the winnings. Soon, Meyer was running his own small-time betting operations, learning the ins and outs of odds, payouts, and, most importantly, the subtle art of cheating. But he wasn't the kind of man who would cheat just for the thrill. Meyer was patient, meticulous, calculating. He understood that real money wasn't made on the streets, but in the shadows, where the numbers were manipulated without anyone knowing. He began to get noticed, not just for his ability to run a game, but for the cold precision with which he ran it. In a world of high-strung, trigger-happy mobsters, Meyer was different. He operated quietly, with a sharp mind and a steady hand, making sure that no one got too excited, too careless. As the years passed, Meyer's empire grew, but it was never a matter of expanding through brute force. Instead, it was a slow, steady climb that came with knowing how to spot the right opportunities, and more importantly, how to avoid the wrong ones. His reputation grew not just as a man who knew the odds, but as a man who could keep his head while others were losing theirs. The bookies, the gamblers, the low-level hustlers, they all began to recognize Lansky as a man who didn't play the game for glory. He played it for power, and power, he knew, came with precision, with control, with understanding every move long before it was made. In the criminal underworld, first blood wasn't about making a kill. It was about learning how to make a living off the game itself. And Meyer Lansky wasn't just learning, it was in his bones now, a natural instinct that would make him a force to be reckoned with. Meyer Lansky never sought the spotlight. While others in the world of organized crime were eager to make their mark with loud acts of violence or public displays of power, Meyer preferred the shadows. He knew that real influence wasn't gained through grand gestures, but through quiet control, the kind that didn't demand attention. In a world of brash personalities and egos, Lansky stood apart, a silent force whose power was rooted in his ability to calculate every move and foresee every outcome. His approach to crime was different from the others. He wasn't interested in the violence or the constant struggle for dominance that so often defined the lives of mobsters. Instead, he focused on the mechanics, the hidden workings of the business. He knew that success in the underworld, much like in any business, depended on stability, on keeping things running smoothly. While the others fought for power, Meyer built systems. He understood the importance of loyalty, of building alliances, and most of all, of ensuring that money moved efficiently, quietly, without drawing attention. Meyer became the silent partner, the man who operated behind the scenes, making the crucial decisions that would shape the future of organized crime. He was the one who set up the games, ran the books, made the calculations, and ensured that everyone got their cut. He was the brain behind the operations, a role that required a level of trust that only a few could offer. And in turn, Meyer's respect within the mob grew not because of his ability to fight or his capacity for cruelty, but because of his unmatched ability to keep things running without ever being seen. He was indispensable. Though Meyer never chased power for its own sake, he realized quickly that with the respect he had earned came influence. He may not have wielded a gun, but he wielded something far more potent, the ability to make people money. In the world of crime, that was what mattered most. The respect he earned wasn't from fear, but from results. His partners came to rely on him, not just for his ability to manage the finances, but because they knew he would always have a plan, always have a way out. Lansky's real gift wasn't in handling the dirty work. It was in ensuring that the dirty work always paid off. In time, Meyer became the kind of figure who didn't need to be front and center. His influence was felt without a word being spoken. He had become the true power behind the throne, the man who made sure the gears of the operation never stopped turning. His name wasn't shouted in the streets, but whispered in boardrooms and backrooms, where decisions were made with cool calculation. To those who understood the game, Meyer Lansky didn't need to be loud. His silence was his strength. Meyer Lansky's rise wasn't about ambition for fame or personal glory. It was always about power, but more importantly, it was about creating something that could endure. The National Crime Syndicate was born not from the barrel of a gun, but from the strategic mind of Lansky, who saw opportunity where others only saw chaos. In the early days, organized crime in America was fractured, each city ruled by its own set of gangsters, each group operating independently. But Meyer, alongside Charles Luciano, saw that the real strength didn't lie in isolated power struggles. It lay in unity, in consolidation. Lansky's financial acumen made him invaluable to Luciano's vision. While others saw a loose alliance of crime families, Meyer saw a blueprint for a national network that could dwarf anything the government or rival criminals could muster. He didn't need to be the public face of the syndicate. His influence was felt in the quiet movements of money, the careful calculations of profits, and the management of the intricate web that connected the families across the country. Meyer was the one who understood that a successful crime syndicate wasn't built on violence alone. It was built on infrastructure, loyalty, and the movement of vast sums of cash. From afar, Meyer orchestrated the financial side of the operation, ensuring that every family's interests were aligned. He wasn't the one pulling the trigger in the street battles, but his mind was behind every deal, every payoff, every laundering scheme. The syndicate grew, slowly at first, with Luciano working to unify the families, while Lansky ensured the money kept flowing, undisturbed and out of sight. His role was never one to seek recognition. He didn't want the headlines or the notoriety that came with power. He preferred to remain behind the scenes, working in the shadows, where he could control the pulse of the syndicate without ever having to show his hand. Lansky's genius lay in his ability to maintain this delicate balance, coordinating across state lines, uniting men who would normally never trust one another, and keeping everything running smoothly. He introduced new systems for managing their operations, creating more efficient ways to run their gambling, bootlegging, and narcotics operations. He also pioneered the idea of a national crime infrastructure, something that stretched far beyond the local rackets. The syndicate wasn't just a group of criminals, it was an empire, and Meyer Lansky was its financial backbone. The rise of the National Crime Syndicate wasn't immediate, but over time, it became the most powerful criminal organization in the world, its reach extending from New York to Chicago, from Las Vegas to Miami. While other mobsters fought for control, Meyer watched from a distance, letting the syndicate grow with quiet efficiency. In the end, the syndicate's success wasn't due to force or fear. It was due to Meyer Lansky's careful planning, his understanding that real power is built on a foundation of trust, money, and patience. Meyer Lansky understood that wealth was never just about what you had in the moment. It was about what you could build for the future. While many of his peers in the criminal world sought to live lavishly in the present, blowing through their earnings on fast cars, expensive suits, and untraceable cash, Meyer took a different approach. He had the foresight to see beyond the immediate thrill of power and wealth. He was playing the long game. The money he made from illegal gambling, bootlegging, and other syndicate operations didn't go straight into his pockets for luxury. It went into something more enduring, something that would outlive the chaos of organized crime. Lansky's ability to think ahead set him apart from the rest of the mob world. He recognized that in a world driven by bloodshed and fleeting power, the only way to truly secure his place was to create something that could weather the storm of time and law enforcement. That's when the idea of investing in legitimate businesses came into focus. Meyer wasn't interested in being known as just another gangster with a bankroll. He wanted to build an empire, one that could withstand the heat of the authorities and the volatility of criminal life. He started small, investing in hotels, casinos, and nightclubs in places like Miami and Las Vegas, seemingly innocent businesses on the surface, but perfect for laundering the mob's profits. Casinos were his particular passion. The allure of a building that always had money coming in, no matter the hand dealt, was irresistible to him. He saw the potential not just for personal gain, but for a steady, reliable source of income that could support the syndicate's operations without the need for constant bloodshed or the ever-present threat of arrest. The casino business, with its constant influx of cash and relative anonymity, allowed Meyer to keep his criminal activities under the radar while still providing the syndicate with a steady flow of money. While others in the mob spent their earnings on short-term pleasures, Lansky reinvested in these businesses, building a legitimate front that not only kept him out of the spotlight, but also positioned him as a powerful businessman in his own right. His investments grew, and with them, so did his influence. No longer just a behind-the-scenes figure in the syndicate, Meyer was now a respected entrepreneur with the means to expand his operations far beyond the scope of the criminal world. What Meyer Lansky understood, better than most, was that the real power wasn't in what you did with your money, it was in how you made it work for you over time. While others gambled with their wealth, Meyer was betting on the future. And as his legitimate businesses flourished, so did his control. His empire wasn't built overnight, but it was built to last, an enduring legacy that would go far beyond the fleeting chaos of the criminal world. Meyer's investments weren't just about growing his wealth, they were about securing his place in a world where power could shift on a dime. Meyer Lansky saw something in the neon lights of Las Vegas that no one else did: an opportunity to turn a fledgling desert town into the epicenter of organized crime. When the city first began to rise in the mid-20th century, it was little more than a series of dusty roads and a few run-down hotels. But to Lansky, it had the potential to be something far bigger, a gambling oasis where fortunes could be made, both above and below the table. While the public saw glitz and glamour, Meyer saw infrastructure, an almost endless supply of money, and an ideal location to launder the syndicate's cash. His involvement was never a matter of blind luck. Meyer was a planner, a strategist who understood that to secure a foothold in the burgeoning gambling industry, he needed to move quietly, carefully. He didn't just want to invest in Las Vegas, he wanted to control it, or at the very least, have his fingers in every profitable pie. His first step was subtle. He became involved in the ownership of casinos, using frontmen to establish his presence. The Flamingo, one of the most famous casinos in Las Vegas, would become one of his crown jewels. But Meyer wasn't about the flashy headlines. He was about ensuring that the money flowed through channels where it would be safe from prying eyes. Lansky's hand in Las Vegas wasn't immediately obvious. He didn't walk around boasting of his stake in the town's fortune, and he certainly wasn't a regular fixture on the casino floors. His work was done in the background, where the real power resided. Meyer knew that the key to Las Vegas's future lay in control, and that control was in the details. He made sure the right people were in charge, that the operations ran smoothly, and that every dollar earned found its way back to the syndicate. His casinos were not just entertainment hubs. They were a carefully constructed empire designed to launder vast amounts of illicit money, to turn shady profits into legitimate-looking operations. Lansky also understood that the more influential Las Vegas became, the more it could serve as a cover for the syndicate's illegal activities. The glittering lights of the Strip were a perfect disguise for the murkier dealings that fueled the city's growth. Meyer's control over the city's gambling scene ensured that the mob's money never stopped flowing, and as Vegas exploded in popularity, so did the syndicate's influence. Las Vegas transformed into a haven for organized crime, and Meyer Lansky was one of the architects of that transformation. He helped build it into a place where crime and entertainment could coexist, each feeding the other. By the time the city had established itself as the gambling capital of the world, Lansky had already positioned himself as one of its most powerful figures, not through headlines or mobster bravado, but through calculated investments and an ability to move in the shadows. Las Vegas, for Meyer, wasn't just a gamble, it was a sure thing. Meyer Lansky wasn't just the financial brains behind the syndicate. He was the silent heartbeat of its operations. In a world where loyalty was often dictated by fear and violence, Lansky's role as the mob's accountant allowed him to avoid the chaos of the streets while controlling its cash flow. He had a mind for numbers that went beyond simple bookkeeping. It was about calculating risk, weighing reward, and ensuring that every dollar earned in the shadows found its way into the right hands. He didn't just count money, he managed it, safeguarded it, and most importantly, he made sure it multiplied. Lansky's talent for making the mob's finances flourish didn't come from brute force or intimidation. It came from precision. His genius lay in how he could keep the books in such a way that the government, the public, and even most of the mob's rivals couldn't touch him. While other figures in the underworld dealt with the fallout of violent retribution, Meyer kept his hands clean, offering the appearance of respectability while overseeing vast sums of ill-gotten gains. For the leaders of organized crime, Lansky was indispensable. His ability to launder money, to move it through legitimate channels while hiding its true origins, made him invaluable. But Meyer's role wasn't as passive as it may have seemed. As the accountant, Lansky had access to the inner workings of the mob's operations, including the decisions that led to murder and mayhem. He wasn't the one to pull the trigger, but he often made sure that everything else went according to plan, especially when it came to cleaning up the messes that followed. Lansky's quiet hand in orchestrating the financial aftermath of hits was an open secret. He understood that to run a successful criminal organization, certain decisions had to be made, decisions that sometimes involved eliminating threats. And when they did, Meyer was there, ensuring that the money trail disappeared, leaving no trace of the violence that fueled the empire. There was no glory for Meyer in this. He didn't revel in the killings or the bloodshed, but as the mob's accountant, he understood the harsh reality of what had to be done. His involvement in multiple murders, while indirect, was crucial. He wasn't just keeping track of money, he was tracking loyalty, relationships, and who might need to be removed for the greater good of the syndicate. If someone crossed the line or became a liability, Meyer's books didn't just reflect their earnings, they reflected their potential cost. In a world where reputation was built on blood, Meyer Lansky's reputation was built on something far more valuable: control. The men who held power in the syndicate relied on him to keep their world running smoothly, even as he stayed in the background, making sure that no one ever noticed how deeply his fingers were embedded in the very foundation of the mob. He never needed to be feared. The numbers spoke for themselves, and in the end, that's all that mattered. Meyer Lansky was more than just a mobster. He was a master of a silent art that kept the wheels of organized crime turning without attracting the attention of law enforcement. He understood better than most that in the world of the mafia, money wasn't just the means to an end, it was the shield, the armor that protected them from the prying eyes of the authorities. While others focused on running numbers, racks, or holding territory, Lansky's genius was in making sure the cash that came in could never be traced back to the source. He wasn't just laundering money. He was building an empire of financial invisibility. Lansky knew the key to his success lay in taking the mob's profits and hiding them in plain sight. He wasn't simply looking for ways to clean the dirty money, but to turn it into something legitimate, something that couldn't be touched. With an accountant's mind and a mobster's connections, he quickly learned how to use legal businesses as cover for illegal enterprises. Casinos, hotels, trucking companies, and even legitimate real estate ventures became his tools for safeguarding the mob's wealth. But Lansky wasn't content just with protecting the money. He wanted it to grow, to be used in ways that not only shielded the mob, but also made them untouchable. His casinos in Las Vegas were one of his crowning achievements. What began as a modest venture with the Flamingo Casino grew into a full-fledged financial machine, one that churned out profits while remaining impervious to the legal system. Through careful ownership, Lansky made sure his operations ran with military precision. Any hint of irregularities was swiftly dealt with, and the cash flowed under the radar. If the government was going to shut one door, he'd open two more. A shift in local laws, a change in public opinion. Lansky adapted with ease, always staying one step ahead. But it wasn't just about having the right businesses, it was about the networks of people who worked for him, who did the heavy lifting while he made the money disappear. He had a keen eye for talent, always finding the right people to operate in the shadows while he handled the long-term strategy. His men weren't just street thugs, they were part of a much bigger machine, one that operated not on violence, but on intelligence, secrecy, and the legal system's own blind spots. For Lansky, crime wasn't a passion, it was a business. He understood better than anyone that a successful criminal operation didn't rely on a flair for violence, but on the ability to manage risk, protect assets, and create an infrastructure that could not only survive law enforcement, but thrive despite it. Lansky's empire was built with a quiet confidence, a belief that no matter how much the government tried to close in, there was always a way to make the money work for them, to make the empire last longer than any law ever could. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. Meyer Lansky's success in the underworld wasn't just a result of his financial savvy. It was also due to his ability to navigate the delicate relationships with some of the most dangerous and influential figures in organized crime. He wasn't a man who made a lot of noise, but he understood that the most powerful men in the business weren't the ones shouting the loudest. Lansky built a network of alliances, threading through the veins of New York, Miami, and beyond, where connections were just as valuable as cash. Charles "Lucky" Luciano was the first among the big players who took Lansky under his wing. Luciano recognized Meyer's quiet intelligence and made him an integral part of his operation. They were a perfect match, Luciano with his bold ambition, and Lansky with his meticulous planning. Lansky was the one who kept the books and smoothed over the rough edges, ensuring that Luciano's criminal empire ran efficiently. But their relationship went beyond business. It was a silent understanding. Luciano trusted Lansky with the heavy lifting, knowing that Meyer's focus was always on the bigger picture. But it wasn't just Luciano who Lansky worked with. He formed a complicated bond with Vito Genovese, who had a reputation for being as cunning as he was ruthless. Genovese's ambition was unmatched, and while he respected Lansky's business acumen, he didn't always trust the quiet man in the background. Their relationship was one built on necessity, but also suspicion. In the world they inhabited, there was little room for weakness. Confrontations between them were often silent, not loud and aggressive, but pointed, the kind of confrontations where a look meant more than words, and every handshake had an unspoken weight. Lansky knew that Genovese was always scheming, always planning his next move, and so he kept his distance, never fully revealing his hand, always a step ahead in the delicate dance of power. Then there was Frank Costello, another key figure in Lansky's orbit. Costello, often called the Prime Minister of the Underworld, had a smooth, charismatic way with people that made him incredibly valuable in high society circles. He had the gift of talking his way out of nearly any situation, and Lansky admired him for it. But even Costello knew that without Lansky's financial expertise, his empire would never have lasted. The two had an unspoken bond, one that held through thick and thin. When it came to money, Lansky was the man who made sure things stayed steady, even when the tempers of the other bosses flared. Behind closed doors, these men may have shared drinks and stories, but the real conversations took place in the silence. Lansky didn't need to raise his voice, he let his actions speak louder than any threat. In the cutthroat world of organized crime, those who understood the delicate balance of power and trust survived. And Lansky's relationships with these bosses proved that sometimes the most dangerous men weren't the ones who shot first, but the ones who knew how to wait. Meyer Lansky's connection to Havana wasn't just about the money. It was about power, opportunity, and control. Long before Fidel Castro's revolution reshaped the Cuban landscape, Havana had become a glittering jewel in the criminal underworld, a place where the rich and powerful could mingle freely with the lawless. Lansky, always the businessman, saw Cuba as a lucrative opportunity, a playground for the mob's wealth and influence. He had a hand in nearly every major casino operation in Havana, from the luxury hotels to the high-stakes tables that attracted tourists from all over the world. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Cuba was a vibrant, bustling city where the lines between the legal and the illegal were often blurred. For Lansky, it was the perfect place to launder money and funnel cash through legitimate-looking ventures. His network of casinos, in particular, were gold mines. Lansky partnered with several powerful Cuban figures, including the dictator Fulgencio Batista's inner circle, who were eager to keep the flow of American money coming into the country. The casinos were lavish, the drinks endless, and the stakes high. But beneath the glitz and glamour, it was Lansky's careful planning and financial acumen that kept the operation running smoothly. While other mobsters played the game with less subtlety, Lansky understood that success lay in building relationships with the right people. His connections to the Cuban government, and particularly to Batista's regime, allowed him to secure the kind of stability that his casinos needed to thrive. There was always a tacit understanding. As long as the casinos kept running smoothly and the money kept flowing, the Cuban government would turn a blind eye to the criminal operations in play. For Lansky, Cuba was the crown jewel of his empire, a place where his money worked as hard as he did, and where he could operate with a level of freedom that was hard to find elsewhere. But when Castro's revolution swept through the country in 1959, Lansky's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. The overthrow of Batista meant the end of the mob's cozy arrangement with the Cuban government. Lansky had no intention of being swept away by the tide of revolution. His ties to the Cuban regime, once a source of his power, became his downfall. With the revolution came the nationalization of all businesses, and Lansky's casinos were no exception. The wealth he had amassed in Cuba evaporated almost overnight. It wasn't just the loss of money, it was the loss of control, of a piece of the world that he had spent years cultivating. Even as Castro's forces closed in, Lansky didn't lose his cool. He adapted, like he always did. He quietly took his operations elsewhere, Miami, Las Vegas, and other places where the underworld could still thrive. But the Cuban experience left a mark on him. Cuba was more than just a business venture. It was a reminder of how quickly fortunes could change, how power could shift overnight, and how a place could go from being a safe haven to a battlefield. In the end, Lansky would never return to Havana, but the lessons he learned in Cuba would echo through the rest of his life. Meyer Lansky was a man of calculation, not passion. He didn't let his emotions rule him, and when it came to handling business, he knew that sometimes people needed to be eliminated to ensure that the empire he was building didn't crumble. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Lansky didn't take pleasure in the violence. He wasn't known for the brutal, hands-on approach of a Vito Genovese or a Lucky Luciano. Instead, he played the long game, keeping his distance from the bloodshed while still managing to orchestrate it when necessary. His role in ordering hits was a cold, meticulous process, one that required as much patience as it did ruthlessness. Lansky understood that the underworld operated on respect, and respect was often maintained through fear. For him, murder wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was a well-considered decision, a business move. If someone became a liability, a traitor, or simply an obstacle in his financial empire, Lansky didn't hesitate to have them removed. His involvement in these killings was always indirect, his hands rarely stained with blood, but the result was the same. He made sure that the person who needed to disappear did just that quietly, without drawing attention, and with minimal fallout. There were moments when Lansky's involvement in murder became impossible to ignore. When his partner, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, pushed too far in Las Vegas, his reckless behavior threatened to unravel the whole operation. Siegel, flamboyant and unpredictable, had dreams of turning the Flamingo Hotel into a lavish showplace, but his constant mismanagement and mounting debts were putting Lansky's carefully constructed empire at risk. Lansky had to make a difficult decision, one that required a level of detachment few could maintain. He didn't want to kill Siegel, but the consequences of his failure were clear. It wasn't long before Bugsy was found dead in his Beverly Hills home, shot multiple times in a way that carried the unmistakable mark of the mob. But Lansky's approach was more than just business, it was about survival. He wasn't a man driven by violence for the sake of it, but he knew the rules of the game. If you didn't play by those rules, you became expendable. He had no use for impulsive outbursts or erratic behavior. The job needed to get done, and sometimes that meant ending a life to protect the greater good of the syndicate. He delegated the dirty work to others, trusted men like the hitmen who did the bidding of the organization, but they knew that the order came from Lansky's direction. He might not be the one pulling the trigger, but his influence reached every corner of the operation. In the shadowy world of organized crime, where loyalty was everything but fragile, Lansky's cold, calculating demeanor was what allowed him to stay on top. His ability to separate the personal from the professional meant that when it was time to make someone disappear, he did so with efficiency, without hesitation, and without remorse. To Lansky, it was just another part of the business, a necessary evil that kept the wheels of the empire turning smoothly, even if it required a killer's code to do so. Meyer Lansky's reputation in the world of organized crime was built on one simple but powerful word: trust. In an industry where loyalty was paramount and betrayal was the quickest ticket to the grave, Lansky was the constant, the man you could rely on when everything else seemed to be crumbling. He didn't rely on flashy displays of power or grand gestures. Instead, he built his empire quietly, methodically, and with a level of integrity that was as rare as it was dangerous. In the chaotic and ever-shifting world of the mob, Lansky had an uncanny ability to keep his word, even when it meant making the hard calls. If he promised to handle a situation, you could be sure that it would be handled, no questions asked. Whether it was securing a new territory, laundering money, or eliminating a problem, Lansky's word was as good as gold. His promise was a bond, one that often meant navigating treacherous waters, where deals were made in smoke-filled rooms, and everything came with a price. But Lansky delivered. He always delivered. This trust didn't just come from his ability to keep business running smoothly. It came from his razor-sharp understanding of people and their weaknesses. He didn't just know how to get things done. He knew how to read the room and manipulate situations to his advantage. When Lansky made an arrangement, it wasn't just about the money. It was about respect, loyalty, and knowing that he could be counted on when things went south. He wasn't the loudest, and he certainly wasn't the flashiest, but Lansky had a way of making people feel secure in their dealings with him. When a deal went wrong, it wasn't Lansky's name that was dragged through the mud. He made sure of that. He was always 2 steps ahead, anticipating problems before they arose and resolving them with a quiet efficiency that spoke volumes. If a body had to be buried to protect the empire, it was buried no fuss, no muss. There were no loose ends, only a tight, well-oiled machine. The old adage in the underworld was simple: keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Lansky took it to heart. He didn't just keep his allies close, he made sure they trusted him implicitly. He was the one the bosses turned to when things got tricky, when the stakes were high and the risk of exposure was real. Lansky didn't ask for loyalty, he earned it. And that was why, in a world full of scheming, double-crossing, and paranoia, Meyer Lansky remained untouchable. The trust factor wasn't just about the deals he struck, It was about the silence that followed. When people knew Lansky was involved, they knew they were in safe hands. There were no broken promises, no loose lips. In an empire where betrayal was a death sentence, Meyer Lansky became a pillar of reliability, a man who understood that true power came not just from fear, but from the trust that kept the entire operation standing tall. Meyer Lansky wasn't just a gangster, he was the financial architect of the mob. While others were running rackets, pulling heists, or making violent power plays, Lansky was quietly, meticulously, building an empire that was as much about wealth as it was about longevity. He had an uncanny ability to make money appear out of thin air, to make it flow cleanly through the system, and to ensure it was never traced back to the hands of those who needed it most. His financial operations became so sophisticated, so intricate, that it wasn't long before Lansky was known as the Bank of the Mob. Lansky's genius lay in his understanding of numbers, but more than that, he understood the art of disguise. He knew that a fortune made in crime had no value unless it could be hidden, washed clean of its bloody origins. Gambling was his first real entry point into the world of money laundering. He wasn't just content to run the numbers, he knew how to create systems where money flowed in and out, never stopping long enough for anyone to notice. His casinos in Cuba, particularly in Havana, became the perfect front. The high rollers came, they gambled, they lost and won, and somewhere in between, Lansky made sure that the illicit cash flowing through his establishments was scrubbed of its origins. But it wasn't just the casinos. Lansky was a master at weaving together legitimate and illegal businesses, creating a financial web that was nearly impossible to untangle. He bought up real estate, invested in legitimate companies, and funneled mob money into these businesses. Money meant to be hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and corporate deals flowed smoothly through these entities, cleaned and legitimized in a way that made it nearly untraceable. Banks, government regulators, and even law enforcement were often too slow or too distracted to catch the moves Lansky was making. What made Lansky's operation so effective was his ability to stay out of sight while still controlling the flow of cash. He wasn't flashy. He didn't throw money around or flaunt his wealth. He was methodical, always working behind the scenes, always ensuring that his fingers were on the pulse without ever letting anyone see how deep his influence truly ran. For those in the know, Lansky was the one to turn to when the stakes were high and the cash needed laundering. He handled it with the same precision he applied to every aspect of his criminal empire. He knew where to place the money, where to hide it, and how to ensure it returned to its rightful owners, clean and untraceable. As the years passed, Lansky's network of operations grew. He became the financial backbone of not just the mafia, but of the entire underworld. His fortune, which was based on 1,000 small transactions and hidden deals, grew into a vast empire of wealth and influence. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the man who could turn dirty money into gold, and in a world where wealth meant power, that was the true genius of Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky wasn't a man of violence, at least. Not in the way some of his peers were. He wasn't the kind to personally pull a trigger or make a grand spectacle out of retribution. But Lansky understood the business of death, just as he understood the business of money. He knew that in the underworld, a hit could be the most effective way to settle scores, maintain control, and send a message. And that the true art of killing was not in the noise, but in the silence. In the unseen, the undetected, and the unspoken. Lansky's relationships with hitmen were built not on fear or brute strength, but on mutual respect and efficiency. He had a keen eye for the quiet killers, those men who could slip into a room, end a life, and disappear without so much as a trace. There was no fanfare, no show of power, just a methodical, almost surgical precision. Lansky learned from them, and in turn, he became their silent partner, the one who would cover the financials, arrange the logistics, and make sure that when the job was done, There were no loose ends to tie up. The quiet killer was a rare breed, someone who could disappear into the shadows without being noticed. Lansky's involvement in these executions was always behind the scenes. He wouldn't tell the hitman how to do his job, but he'd ensure they had the resources, the alibis, and the safety nets they needed. Whether it was setting up the logistics for the hit or helping to wash the bloodstains from the books, Lansky made sure everything was in place. He understood that a job well done left no room for mistakes. A body could always be buried, but a slip-up left a trail, and in Lansky's world, a trail meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Lansky's hitmen didn't carry the same air of ruthlessness that people expected of mob enforcers. They weren't the loud, bombastic killers of the movies, gunning down enemies in public streets. These men operated in the shadows, with calculated efficiency. They were often calm, collected, and emotionally detached. They understood the importance of discretion, knowing that a job executed cleanly would always yield better results than the violence of a public spectacle. Lansky admired their cool-headedness, their ability to move in and out of dangerous situations without leaving a trace. For Lansky, the art of the quiet kill was more than just a tool of the trade. It was a lesson in precision. It taught him that, sometimes, the best way to deal with a problem wasn't through force, but through subtlety. It wasn't the big moves that built the empire. It was the small ones, the unseen ones, the ones that left no mark. Lansky didn't need to be in the front line. He understood that the true power of a killer was in his ability to make the death of a target feel like the quiet passing of a shadow, swift, clean, and completely unnoticed. The world of organized crime was never without its tensions. In fact, the higher you climbed, the sharper the knives became. Lansky knew that as well as anyone. His alliances were never forged in the heat of battle, but in cold, calculated strategy. He learned early on that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones closest to you, the ones whose motives weren't clear until blood had already been spilled. Rivalries inside the mob didn't scream for attention like the violent chaos on the streets. They simmered beneath the surface, quiet and dangerous, until the time came to either outsmart or outlast. Lansky's genius wasn't just in his ability to manage money, but in his capacity to navigate the labyrinth of shifting loyalties and power struggles within the mob. While others were scrambling, making rash decisions or taking up arms against their enemies, Lansky stayed detached, watching the moves like a chessboard. The storms of violence that swept through the streets and boardrooms didn't faze him. He understood that bloodshed wasn't just about death, it was about positioning. Every bullet fired, every fight that broke out, was a ripple in the water, and Lansky knew exactly how to turn those ripples to his advantage. As the mafia itself began to fragment, with different factions jockeying for power, Lansky knew that keeping a cool head was the key to survival. While rivals bled in the streets, he focused on what mattered: power, money, and loyalty. His ability to remain unaffected by the violence around him gave him an edge that others lacked. It wasn't just about being ruthless, it was about being patient, knowing when to strike and, just as importantly, when to wait. When tensions flared, Lansky would stay behind the scenes, letting the chaos play out. Others around him would rush into battle, trying to hold on to their power, tearing at each other's throats. Lansky, however, rarely raised his voice. His power was in his silence, in his ability to let others destroy themselves while he sat back and assessed the pieces. He knew that in the end, the ones who rushed were often the ones who fell first. In the midst of all the bloodshed, Lansky remained a steady, calculating force. He wasn't concerned with taking sides or picking fights. He understood that the greatest weapon he possessed wasn't a gun or a crew of loyal soldiers, it was his mind. While others fought to claim their territories, Lansky kept his focus on building something more valuable than any turf: influence, wealth, and a network of allies that stretched far beyond the reach of petty rivalries. When the blood stopped flowing, it was Lansky who emerged as the quiet victor. He didn't need to fight wars in the open. He won by outthinking his opponents, staying calm, and letting the others do the dirty work. Blood in the water meant nothing to him, he simply knew how to swim. Meyer Lansky's influence in Las Vegas didn't come overnight, but when it did, it was as deliberate and precise as everything else he touched. By the time he set his sights on the neon lights of the desert, the city was already becoming a magnet for the kinds of vice that he knew best: gambling, booze, and women. But to truly control Vegas, Lansky understood that you needed more than just money. You needed connections, influence, and the kind of quiet, persistent power that nobody could see until it was too late. Lansky didn't rush into the city like others might have. He moved carefully, almost like a shadow, getting a feel for the territory before making any bold moves. He knew that the real game in Vegas wasn't on the casino floors, but in the back rooms, the deals made under the table, and the quiet exchanges between the politicians who ran the city and the criminals who kept it running. It was there, in the shadows, that Lansky knew he could build his empire. His ability to navigate both sides of the law made him indispensable. To the politicians, he was a man who could deliver results, a man with deep pockets who understood the intricacies of the gaming industry like nobody else. To the criminals, Lansky was a steady hand, a man who knew how to launder money and grease palms without drawing too much attention. His connections with men like Bugsy Siegel, who had initially brought the Flamingo Hotel and Casino to life, allowed him to enter the game with both respect and resources. But it was Lansky's foresight that made him more than just a player. It made him the architect. Lansky didn't just run casinos. He ran the flow of money that passed through them. He built alliances, sometimes with men who seemed like polar opposites, but who shared a common need for discretion and profit. With every deal he made, Lansky extended his reach further, becoming the quiet power behind Vegas's glitzy facade. When the casinos began to grow, so did his influence, stretching from the gambling tables to the political backrooms, where laws were made or broken with a handshake and a stack of cash. But Lansky wasn't just playing for money. He was playing for control. And control in Vegas meant more than owning a few properties. It meant being able to influence the direction of the city itself. He worked with labor unions, keeping a careful balance between keeping the workers happy and ensuring that nobody crossed the line. He had a knack for knowing who to pay off, who to keep on side, and, more importantly, who to stay away from. His name was whispered in the halls of power, not as a threat but as a reminder of the delicate balance between order and chaos. In the end, Las Vegas became Meyer Lansky's greatest masterpiece. It wasn't about the money, though the money was immense. It was about the power, the control that he could wield, not just in the dark alleys of crime, but in the well-lit corners of the city's most luxurious hotels. Meyer Lansky, despite his towering reputation in the criminal world, was a man who kept a sharp distinction between his underworld empire and his home life. To the outside world, he was the calculating mastermind behind some of the largest operations the mob had ever seen. But at home, in the quiet corners of his life that few ever glimpsed, Lansky was a husband and a father. His most private battles fought not in boardrooms or back alleys, but behind closed doors. In his personal life, Lansky was far less the hardened gangster than one might imagine. He was a devoted husband to his wife, Thelma, a woman who had known the quiet side of Meyer that many would never see. They had 2 children, and though Lansky's name was known in every corner of the criminal world, he made sure his family remained untouched by the shadow of his empire. He adored his children, often sending them away to schools far from the city's grime, trying to shield them from the life that had shaped him. But even in the safety of their suburban home, there was a silent understanding between him and Thelma, an unspoken acknowledgement of the world Meyer inhabited and the delicate balance he was constantly maintaining. He was a man who understood loyalty, not just as a tool of the mob, but as a fundamental thread in the fabric of family life. His loyalty to his wife, his children, was absolute. But it wasn't always an easy loyalty to maintain, for Lansky was not a man without contradictions. He loved his family fiercely, but his ties to the mob demanded he live a double life that constantly threatened to pull him apart. Every time he kissed his wife goodbye, every time he watched his children grow, there was a quiet war inside him, a tug between survival and loyalty, between the life he had chosen and the family he had vowed to protect. As much as Lansky was committed to his family, he was equally committed to staying alive. This meant that sometimes his family's safety had to be kept at arm's length from the dangerous web he wove. While the world saw him as a trusted figure in the criminal underworld, he was also keenly aware that his life, his very survival, was often at the mercy of people who didn't hesitate to turn on you when things went wrong. His secretive nature kept the people he loved as far removed from his criminal world as possible. Yet the constant pressure of living on the edge, of being both loved and feared, weighed heavily on him. Despite the danger that loomed over him, Lansky tried to provide a normal life for his family, even if it was a life that had to be constructed behind carefully drawn curtains. Every day he walked a fine line, not just between the law and crime, but between being a father and a feared mob boss. The fact that his children grew up without fully understanding the depths of his criminal empire was both a blessing and a burden, one that Lansky carried quietly, silently hoping that the life they lived would somehow never catch up to them. Betrayal in the world Lansky occupied was inevitable. It came with the territory, as much a part of the game as gambling or taking a life. But nothing could prepare Meyer for the sting of it, not when it came from someone he trusted, someone he considered family. For years, Lansky had navigated the volatile currents of organized crime, with one guiding principle: loyalty above all else. But the ruthless nature of the underworld had a way of distorting even the deepest bonds, and one day, that betrayal came crashing down on him. It began with whispers, the kind that were barely audible, but they grew louder with time. A trusted associate, someone who had been with Lansky through thick and thin, had made a deal with a rival syndicate, cutting Lansky out of a lucrative business arrangement. It wasn't just a simple backstabbing, it was an entire network of secrets and lies. The man had made his move, thinking he could outsmart Lansky, believing that his loyalty could be bought. He didn't know that Meyer had long ago perfected the art of seeing through such moves. Lansky could feel the cracks forming in the foundation he had built, and he knew he couldn't let it go unanswered. Lansky's cold calculation was the perfect shield in these moments. He didn't rush into action. That was never his style. But the anger was there, seething beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a blow to the empire he had spent years building, a stain on the careful system he had orchestrated. It wasn't enough to simply punish the man. No, Lansky needed to send a message. He needed to remind everyone who the true power was, and that betrayal would be met with ruthless retribution. The fallout was swift, as expected. Lansky's men were efficient, and the message was clear. The traitor was found, brought to Lansky, in a way that allowed no escape, no negotiation. There was no room for mercy when loyalty was broken so casually. Lansky didn't need to say much. His reputation, his methodical approach to dealing with disloyalty, spoke louder than any words ever could. It was an example to all who thought they could get away with betrayal. There were no second chances, no room for redemption in the face of treachery. For Lansky, the incident was a harsh reminder that in his world, there were no real friends, no lasting alliances beyond business. He had built an empire on trust, but trust was fragile. He didn't show weakness, but deep down, the betrayal left its mark. It shook him, rattled the foundation he had worked so hard to maintain. He became even more guarded, more aware of the people around him. The game was unforgiving, and the rules had shifted. For Lansky, trust would never come easy again, and neither would the peace he once believed was possible in this brutal world. The syndicate was a well-oiled machine, but like any intricate operation, its gears had a tendency to grind when the pressure was on. Over the years, Meyer Lansky had earned his reputation as the calm in the storm, the man who kept the peace when others were too quick to start a war. But even he couldn't ignore the simmering tensions within the syndicate forever. Different factions, each with their own ambitions, began to chafe against one another, their power struggles pushing Lansky to the edge. It was never a matter of loyalty to him. Lansky had surrounded himself with men who were loyal to the cause, to the dollar, and to the network of influence that had been carefully cultivated. The issue was never about trust, it was about ambition. As money flowed in like a river, the temptations grew stronger, and with it came the hunger for more control. The players had changed. Men who once worked in unison began to question Lansky's authority, seeing in him not a leader, but a barrier to their own ambitions. As the rivalries festered, Lansky found himself walking a fine line, carefully balancing the shifting allegiances of the men who had once trusted him with everything. He was the mediator, the fixer, the one who could hold the factions together when their egos threatened to pull them apart. But every negotiation, every deal, felt like a game of Russian roulette. One wrong move, and the peace he had so carefully maintained would shatter. He knew these men too well. He knew they were ready to pounce the moment they sensed weakness. It was no longer about keeping the books clean, it was about keeping the blood off the streets. Lansky took long, solitary walks through the quiet of his thoughts. There was no shortage of ways to restore order in the syndicate: bribes, threats, even the occasional killing. But he didn't want to burn the whole house down. What he needed was something more subtle. A way to guide the factions back into alignment, without the streets running red with blood. He played his cards with precision, allowing just enough space for the men to fight over territory, but always making sure no one could get too comfortable. The illusion of freedom, of control, was just enough to keep them in check. It was a delicate dance, one that required him to remain untouchable while still appearing to be at the center of the action. But Lansky knew the truth. Even the most seasoned players could only hold the reins for so long before something had to give. The question wasn't whether there would be a blow-up, it was when and how much he could control it. Every move Lansky made, every word spoken, was calculated as he weighed the costs of letting the tensions boil over against the risk of keeping the peace at any cost. But one thing was certain: sooner or later, the syndicate's fractured factions would have to face their own inevitable collision. And when that moment came, Lansky would need to decide whether he could hold the shattered pieces together, or whether he would become another casualty in the underworld he had built. The walls were closing in, a slow suffocation that Lansky could feel in his bones. For years, he had navigated the criminal underworld with a cool, calculating precision. He understood power and how to keep it. But now, even his sharp mind could sense the tightening grip of his enemies. They were no longer content to operate in the shadows. They were growing bolder, more brazen, and Lansky knew that his time of quiet dominance was slipping away. It wasn't just the rival families, the shifting allegiances. It was something more insidious, a tightening noose he couldn't quite escape. The whispers grew louder. The fear grew stronger. In the quiet of his office, Lansky sat, his fingers tapping on the desk in a rhythmic pattern. It was a nervous tick, the only sign of the panic building inside him. He had always thrived in the silence, the space between decisions. But now, it felt like a deafening storm brewing just outside his door. He'd heard the rumors people were talking. Even his closest allies were looking at him with a new, uncertain gaze. There were men in his own ranks who had started questioning his methods, his control, and worse still, his vulnerability. He knew that a king on a throne was one thing, but a king without a crown was a target. The tension was unbearable. Lansky's trust, the thing that had carried him this far, had begun to fray. Men he had once relied on began to make moves without him. Deals were struck behind his back. Power consolidated in corners where he could no longer see. His network, the very foundation of his empire, was no longer as impenetrable as it once had been. The whispers, the subtle shifts in behavior, it was all too much. Even the quiet, which he had once adored, now felt like a trap, a silence that masked the deadly intent closing in on him from every direction. There was no more time for subtlety, no more space for diplomacy. Lansky needed to act, and he needed to do so with the brutal efficiency he had once been known for. He began to make calls, setting up meetings with men who had once worked for him, men who could be trusted, or at least bought. He put his back to the wall and began playing a game he had avoided for years, the game of pure survival. A desperate play was in motion, one that would either restore his grip on power or shatter everything he had built. He wasn't sure which was more terrifying, the thought of losing it all, or the act of clawing his way back. But one thing was certain: Lansky was never going to fall quietly. He would either win this final game or die trying. The power he had built wasn't just about money, it was about control. And in Lansky's mind, the cost of losing it was far worse than anything else. He had fought too long, too hard, to watch it crumble because of someone else's ambition. This was his empire, and he was going to make sure it stayed that way, no matter the cost. The bodies started piling up, slowly at first, like a warning. One here, another there. A rival found dead in a back alley. A man who had once been a trusted ally, now bleeding out in the street. His own men gone silent as the gunfire echoed through the night. Lansky watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable, his mind already working, calculating, weighing the consequences. It wasn't just about the dead, it was about the message. Every body was another warning to anyone thinking of testing his power. The pattern had begun to form. His enemies, those who once feared his cold efficiency, had started to push. The underworld, always a place where violence thrived, now seemed to be spiraling out of control. The rival families, always eyeing his territory, were closing in, and some of the old soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to him were now slipping away. Lansky could feel the shift, the tectonic movement of power beneath the surface. His rivals weren't just gunning for his turf, they were gunning for him. It had become personal. And so, Lansky responded with ruthless precision, his hand never wavering as he pulled the strings. He had never been the type to act on emotion. There was no place for that in his world. But there was a method to every kill, a cold calculation behind each execution. When a man stepped out of line, he was taken out quickly, cleanly, no mess, no fuss. Even when government agents began circling closer, sniffing around his operations, Lansky knew what had to be done. They had to be silenced before they could cause too much trouble. Bodies were buried, evidence erased, and the world kept spinning, one death at a time. But the blood began to saturate the streets, and with it came the growing whispers of his reputation. Lansky was known as a man who preferred to stay behind the scenes, the architect of the empire without ever having to get his hands dirty. But now, as the bodies piled up, the whispers grew louder. People were starting to notice. It wasn't just his financial genius, his quiet control over the world of crime, that earned him respect. It was the quiet efficiency with which he eliminated anyone who threatened that world. The deaths weren't just about business. They were a reminder that in Lansky's world, the consequences of disloyalty were as cold and final as the ledger he kept in his mind. The body count continued to rise, the smell of blood mixing with the stench of power, and Lansky's grip on the underworld seemed more ironclad than ever. But even as he sat behind the safety of his desk, dealing with the next round of schemes, He couldn't ignore the nagging thought that his empire was starting to attract more attention than ever. His enemies were learning, adapting, growing bolder. For every body he buried, another enemy was born, waiting for his chance to strike. The blood had become a part of him now, a symbol of the empire he had built and would protect no matter the cost. When Lucky Luciano was arrested, it felt like the whole underworld shifted on its axis. The man who had redefined organized crime, who had shaped the direction of the American mafia, was suddenly behind bars. It was as though a part of the empire had been ripped out, leaving a gaping hole. But in that moment of uncertainty, Meyer Lansky remained calm, his mind already turning to the next move. Luciano's capture was a blow, no doubt. His arrest disrupted the delicate balance of power within the mafia, and for a time, it seemed like the syndicate would falter. But Lansky, ever the strategist, saw opportunity where others saw chaos. He didn't need to shout from the rooftops to take control. He had no intention of becoming the face of the organization. Instead, he would become the quiet force that held everything together, the invisible hand behind the scenes. Lansky understood something that many didn't. Real power wasn't about being seen. It was about being indispensable. And in this moment, as Luciano's absence created a vacuum, Lansky's importance only grew. He began to assert his influence more openly, even though his style remained as subtle as ever. With Luciano out of the picture, Lansky took on a more prominent role in the management of the syndicate's operations. He became the one people turned to when decisions needed to be made, when money had to be laundered, when deals needed to be struck. He kept the machine running smoothly, ensuring the flow of cash, the protection of assets, and the elimination of threats, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a ruthless precision that few ever saw coming. While others focused on the flashy world of power struggles, Lansky continued to operate in the shadows, his eyes always on the long game. He knew that with Luciano out of the way, the other factions in the syndicate would begin to jockey for position. Tensions were high, and men who had once feared Luciano's wrath now saw an opportunity to carve out their own territories. But Lansky was far too calculating to let the chaos turn into a war. He made his alliances, cemented his loyalty to those who could offer him stability, and ensured that the money kept flowing, regardless of who thought they were in charge. Luciano's arrest might have shaken the foundation of the organization, but Lansky's steady hand kept it intact. As the world around him spun, Lansky stayed grounded, always thinking 2 steps ahead. The power struggle that followed would shape the future of the mafia. But Lansky knew that the most important thing wasn't winning, it was surviving. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. The heat was beginning to close in. For years, Meyer Lansky had carefully orchestrated his empire from the shadows, always a step ahead, always calculating. But now, with law enforcement ramping up its assault on organized crime, the walls were starting to tighten. The government was no longer content with just small raids and arrests. They had made it their mission to dismantle the criminal syndicates, and Lansky knew they were coming for him. It wasn't the first time the law had tried to snare him, but this time felt different. The pressure was relentless, and the media buzzed with stories of crackdowns on mafia families across the country. The government, armed with new resources, was no longer just reacting to criminal activities. It was proactively hunting down the very heart of organized crime. Lansky had spent decades building his empire with an intricate web of legal businesses, shadow operations, and a network of corrupt officials. But even he knew that this level of scrutiny would be harder to escape. The FBI, the IRS, and local law enforcement agencies were working in tandem, and they had a singular focus: Lansky. His name had become synonymous with organized crime, and the government was determined to make an example out of him. They had spies in place, informants feeding them information, and surveillance that tracked his every move. Lansky, always the cool-headed operator, had always trusted in his ability to stay hidden in plain sight. But now, it seemed like no matter how far he dug, the trap was starting to close. His allies, too, were feeling the pressure. Those who had once been untouchable in the criminal world were starting to crack under the strain of the relentless investigation. The fear of being swept up in the dragnet was spreading, and even Lansky's most loyal men were beginning to question their place in the operation. The cracks in his empire, once imperceptible, were now widening. Those who had trusted him without question were starting to look over their shoulders, unsure whether he could protect them any longer. Lansky had always been able to anticipate danger, but this felt different. The government was playing a long game, and it was working. They weren't rushing in, making arrests in a frenzy. They were tightening the noose, slowly, methodically. It was a game of patience, and Lansky, for all his acumen, was starting to realize that patience was a weapon he had little defense against. The stakes had never been higher. The power Lansky had worked so long to consolidate now hung in the balance. His empire, built on carefully calculated moves and quiet influence, was under siege. And as the trap closed in, Lansky's every decision, every move, would become a matter of life or death, not just for him, but for the entire criminal network he had spent a lifetime creating. The tensions inside the syndicate had been simmering for years, but now they were on the brink of boiling over. Long-time alliances were starting to fracture, and the delicate balance that Lansky had spent decades maintaining was beginning to unravel. The mob, once a unified force in the world of organized crime, was now a battleground. The factions within it were growing bolder, more violent, and more impatient with each passing day. Lansky had always prided himself on his ability to keep the peace, to be the quiet force that moved behind the scenes, keeping everything running smoothly. But peace was a commodity that was quickly becoming scarce. Rivalries, old and new, were threatening to tear the syndicate apart. Some of the younger, more ambitious players in the game were eager for power, pushing the older guard aside. It was an uncomfortable shift, one that Lansky, despite his careful nature, could no longer ignore. He had always stayed neutral, watching from the sidelines, but neutrality was a luxury he could no longer afford. The stakes had been raised. With government pressure intensifying, the last thing the syndicate needed was internal strife. Lansky, who had been the one to hold the purse strings and keep the flow of money running smoothly, was now being pulled into the war within. His silence, once a shield, was now seen as indecisiveness by some and outright betrayal by others. He couldn't afford to be the man caught between factions anymore. His old allies, like Charles Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese, had their own ambitions. They weren't the same men they once were. Their views hardened over years of bloodshed and betrayal. Lansky could see it. Each of them was looking out for their own interests, thinking that their time had come. But Lansky wasn't ready to let go just yet. He knew the mob's war was inevitable, but the way it unfolded, the way each faction would rise or fall, was something he could still shape if only he chose the right side. The day came when Lansky had to make a decision. He couldn't sit idly by while men he had worked with for years fought to control the future of the syndicate. He knew that choosing sides meant more than just picking an ally. It meant staking his future on the outcome of the war. There would be no turning back. With one final glance at the destruction brewing on the horizon, Lansky made his choice. It was a decision that would forever alter the balance of power within the mob. In a world where loyalty was both a weapon and a liability, Lansky understood better than anyone the brutal cost of war. But even as he stepped into the fray, calculating each move with precision, he couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest battle wasn't going to be fought with bullets or deals. It was going to be fought within himself. The sun had always shone brightest over Las Vegas, casting its glittering glow across the neon lights and the bustling casinos. But behind the dazzling exterior, the mob had built a silent empire. its veins running deep beneath the Strip, pumping illicit money through its carefully constructed operations. For years, Meyer Lansky had been the architect of this empire, his fingers in every deal, his mind calculating the odds. Vegas was more than just a cash cow. It was a symbol of power, a trophy that the mob could hold up and flaunt to the world. But as time went on, that gleam began to fade, and cracks started to show. New players had entered the scene, hungry for a slice of the pie. Politicians and businessmen, once content to turn a blind eye, were now eyeing the city's potential for legitimate profits. They saw the mob's influence as a stain on Vegas's reputation, something that needed to be cleaned up if they were ever to take it to the next level. Lansky had been one of the first to recognize the changing tides, but even he couldn't have predicted how quickly things would spiral out of control. The pressure began to mount from all sides. The federal government, no longer willing to tolerate the mob's dominance in the gambling capital of the world, started to tighten the noose. Investigations into the mob's operations grew more intense, with agents working around the clock to uncover the connections between organized crime and the Vegas casinos. Lansky had always been a man of quiet influence, preferring to operate in the shadows, but even his carefully constructed network of political connections couldn't shield him from the growing heat. As law enforcement closed in, new forces began to take root. The rise of corporate interests and high-profile investors shifted the balance of power in ways that Lansky hadn't anticipated. The old guard was being edged out, replaced by men who saw the potential for Vegas to be something more cleaner, brighter, and more profitable than ever before. For all his brilliance in running the financial side of things, Lansky was still a gangster at heart, and those new players, with their boardrooms and suits, felt like strangers to him. The inevitable fallout was swift. Deals once made in back rooms now went public. The mob's grip on Vegas loosened as rival factions fought for control, each of them more desperate to secure their stake. Lansky, who had been the mastermind behind the rise of the city's criminal underbelly, now found himself fighting to keep what little he had left. The very city that had been built on his blood and sweat was slipping through his fingers. In the end, Vegas wasn't a place to be conquered by the mob forever. It had always been a place of fleeting dreams, a glittering mirage built on the backs of those willing to take risks. But Lansky had built it, and now, as the city's soul began to shift, he knew that even the best-laid plans could be undone. The Strip might still shine, but the days of mob rule were quickly fading. The walls around Meyer Lansky's empire had always been built with careful precision. For decades, he had navigated the treacherous waters of organized crime, his hands always steady, his mind always calculating. But now, the storm was closing in. The FBI had finally shifted its focus to the man known as the mob's accountant. The whispers had started to grow louder, and the stakes had never been higher. Lansky had always been a man who preferred the shadows. His empire, vast and intricate, ran from behind closed doors. The casinos, the banks, the rackets, all of it tied together like a well-oiled machine, with Lansky pulling the strings from afar. But now, with the government tightening its grip, the machine was starting to sputter. Federal agents, armed with more resources and political will than ever before, began to zero in on him, tracking every move, every whisper, every connection. It wasn't just the FBI. Other government agencies, all with a vested interest in bringing down the mob, began working in tandem, coordinating their efforts to take down the empire Lansky had built from nothing. He'd always known this day would come, but even the most seasoned criminals couldn't predict the weight of the crackdown bearing down on them. His name had become a fixture in their crosshairs, and soon, every aspect of his life, every person, every deal, every transaction was under the microscope. Lansky was no stranger to pressure. He had survived wars, rivalries, betrayals, but this was different. The government was closing in, with a fervor that went beyond mere ambition. This was personal, and they had the tools to make it stick. Every safe house, every hiding place he once thought secure, was compromised. Agents were staking out his known associates, monitoring his movements, and making moves to surround him on all fronts. The quiet man who had spent years building the most intricate financial empire the world had ever seen now found himself on the run. Lansky, ever the tactician, knew that evasion would be his only option. He didn't panic, didn't lose his cool, he simply went to ground. He took the necessary precautions, changed his appearance, used decoy vehicles, and vanished into the underworld's most obscure corners. But even for him, the weight of it all was suffocating. Every conversation felt like a trap, every movement a calculated risk. There was no place left untouched by the watchful eyes of law enforcement. The hunt for Meyer Lansky wasn't just a search for a man. It was the pursuit of a legend, a figure who had once moved freely between the worlds of power and crime. Now, that same world was closing its doors, one by one, and Lansky's empire was crumbling beneath him. No longer the untouchable mastermind, he had become the hunted, and even in the face of it all, he knew that no matter how deep he buried himself, the truth remained. The hunt had begun, and this time, it might just end with him. Meyer Lansky had always prided himself on his ability to keep the wheels of his empire turning smoothly. But the moment of reckoning was coming, and this time, the threat wasn't coming from outside his operation. It was from within. Those he trusted, men who had grown fat off the deals, the risks, and the bloodshed, began to question his leadership. Slowly at first, whispers turned into murmurs. Those whispers would soon turn into a loud clamor, echoing through the corridors of his empire. The first sign of betrayal came quietly, a subtle shift in loyalty that Lansky, ever vigilant, caught just in time. A trusted associate, a man he'd known for years, made a decision that seemed small, harmless, even but in the underworld, every action had consequences. The man had cut a deal behind Lansky's back. It was a business transaction, simple enough on the surface, but it was a violation of the code they'd all sworn to uphold. The code Meyer had built his empire on. Loyalty had always been the bedrock of their operations. To betray that trust was to betray the very foundation of everything they'd worked for. Lansky, cold as always, addressed the betrayal swiftly. His method was always to strike hard, send a message that no one could misinterpret. But that was only the beginning. It was as if the floodgates had been opened, and one by one, the cracks in his foundation started to grow. More men began to turn. It wasn't just the lower ranks now. It was the men who had sat at his table, who had shared his victories, who had profited alongside him. They saw the pressure mounting. Lansky's fall from grace was no longer a rumor. It was a reality. They began to sense the winds of change, and in the world of organized crime, where weakness is exploited, even the slightest scent of fear can breed treachery. The betrayal wasn't just business now. It was personal. The men Lansky had once trusted with his life had begun whispering to his enemies, feeding them information, cutting deals behind his back. They believed they could take his place, carve their own paths, and grab a piece of the empire. But Lansky knew better. He knew that a man who betrays once will betray again. It was only a matter of time before the weight of his own paranoia would push him to make the only decision he could: eliminate the threat. With cold precision, Lansky began to weed out the disloyal, one by one. The men who had once sat with him now found themselves looking over their shoulders. The trap had been set, but this time, Meyer was in control. As the betrayals stacked up, so did the bodies. And in the brutal world Lansky had helped create, trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt once broken. It was gone forever. The empire was crumbling, and Lansky, the calculating mastermind, was left to watch as the men who had once been his family tore it all apart from the inside out. Meyer Lansky was never a man to panic. He had spent decades in the shadows, working the angles, always calculating, always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. But as the walls began to close in, even his cool demeanor couldn't mask the gravity of the situation. The empire he had built, one founded on money, power, and loyalty, was crumbling. His name had become synonymous with the criminal underworld. And now, after years of staying untouchable, the law was finally catching up. Lansky had known this day would come, but nothing could truly prepare a man for the feeling of being hunted, for knowing that every move he made was being watched. The first thing Lansky did was what he knew best. He ran the numbers. He had spent years building a financial empire, one that spanned borders and industries. His money was as liquid as it came, and if anyone could hide it, it was him. Lansky had always been the mob's accountant, the man who knew how to make dirty money look clean, how to turn an illicit gambling operation into a legitimate investment portfolio. But now, as the heat was turned up, it wasn't just about moving cash or laundering profits. It was about survival. His network of safe houses, offshore accounts, and shadow companies became his new arsenal. The deeper he went underground, the more calculated he became. Lansky didn't simply go into hiding. He restructured. Each move was methodical. He didn't run to another city, to some far-off land where he could hide among the common folk. That wasn't his style. He moved quietly, using the very systems he had spent years perfecting to cover his tracks. Fake identities, shell companies, untraceable wire transfers, all part of the game. To the outside world, he was still just another man, a ghost. But beneath the surface, Lansky was orchestrating an escape plan that would leave no trace. He knew that the longer he stayed out of sight, the harder it would be for them to catch him. Time was on his side. In the underworld, information was as valuable as money, and Lansky had a vast network of informants who were loyal to him for one simple reason. They owed him. They owed him for their rise, for the wealth he had helped them amass, and they would keep his secret for as long as it suited them. Every transaction, every phone call, every face in the crowd could be a liability, so Lansky stayed out of the spotlight, communicating only when necessary and through the most untraceable means. But as the months passed, Lansky began to feel the weight of isolation. The empire was no longer a thing of grand gestures and high stakes. It had become a series of moves, each one more desperate than the last. And even though he was a master at running the numbers, at calculating risk, the only number that ever seemed to matter now was the one ticking down in his head, the number of days he had left before his luck ran out. Meyer Lansky had always been a man of control, a master of his environment. But now, in the shadow of constant fear, even he couldn't escape the toll of his own decisions. The years of running, the nights spent in fear, the constant vigilance had begun to wear on him. His health, once robust from decades of calculating deals and quietly running his empire, was beginning to betray him. There were days when his body felt like it belonged to someone else, his joints stiff, his chest tight with the pressure of a life spent looking over his shoulder. The fear of arrest, of being caught, gnawed at him like a slow, silent predator. Every step felt heavier, every movement slower. The man who had once commanded armies of men, whose word had been law in the underworld, now found himself a prisoner in his own skin, unable to trust anyone or anything. Lansky moved between hideouts, never staying in one place for too long, slipping through the cracks like a ghost. He was careful, always calculating, but the truth was undeniable. The empire he had built, the power he had once wielded with ease, was slipping through his fingers. The quiet was louder now, the stillness deafening. There were no more phone calls from his old associates, no more cards on the table with men like Luciano or Genovese. Even the streets, once his domain, felt unfamiliar, alien. He couldn't step foot in the places that once felt like home. The air felt too thick, the shadows too long. Lansky wasn't just running from the law. He was running from time itself, watching his legacy fade with each passing day. But it wasn't just the physical toll that haunted him. In the rare moments when he could allow his mind to wander, the weight of what he had become pressed down on him. The quiet contemplation of a life lived by shadows, of the men he had betrayed and the deals he had made, now made him question everything. The world he had built, the money, the power, the respect, had all been earned with blood. And now, with age creeping up on him and his body failing, it felt like it had all been for nothing. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, had lost some of their luster. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled with the weight of 1,000 decisions that had come back to haunt him. He was a man in hiding, no longer the towering figure he once was, just a shadow of himself. The empire he had built seemed a distant memory, something that belonged to a different man. The game had changed, and Lansky, for the first time in his life, wasn't sure if he could keep playing. Meyer Lansky had always been a step ahead, a man who knew how to disappear when the heat turned up. But even for someone as resourceful as him, his final escape would require more than just quick thinking. It would demand a level of finesse, a calculated risk that only a man like him could pull off. After years of evading the law in America, Lansky finally made his move. He slipped through the fingers of the authorities once again, this time taking refuge far from the streets of New York, far from the world he had once controlled with such precision. Israel became his destination, a place where he could hide in plain sight. But even here, his past lingered like a shadow, impossible to outrun. The promise of safety in the Middle East was complicated by the web of international law that now surrounded him. Though he had once been the one pulling the strings, Lansky now found himself caught in a different kind of game, a game where the rules were foreign and the stakes higher than ever before. The legal system in Israel, with its extradition treaties and complex international laws, was an entirely new battlefield. He had known that going to Israel would be a risk, but the alternative was far worse. To remain in hiding in America, where the pressure from the FBI was closing in tighter each day, would only delay the inevitable. Israel, with its rich ties to the Jewish community and its lenient stance on some international legal matters, was his best chance for survival. But as always, nothing was ever simple for Lansky. His reputation followed him across borders, and even in the land of his ancestors, his past caught up with him. He wasn't a fool. He knew the government had its eyes on him, and soon, the whispers of his arrival would reach the authorities. The dance of evasion continued, this time against not just American agents, but now Israeli law enforcement too. He navigated this new terrain carefully, always cautious, never sure if the next knock on his door would be from a friendly face or a foe ready to expose him. The world of international justice wasn't as easily manipulated as the underworld he had once mastered, and Lansky was learning that no matter how far he ran, the past always had a way of catching up. Still, Lansky kept his head down, made new connections, and continued his quiet existence in Tel Aviv. Yet, even in his final refuge, he was still haunted by the ghosts of those he had crossed and the empire that had once been his. Lansky had built his fortune on the foundation of crime, but in the end, it was that same legacy that left him forever on the run, forever a man without peace. The final escape, like all the others before it, was not a true escape at all, but another chapter in the long, tangled story of a life lived in the shadows. Meyer Lansky had spent decades evading the law, a shadow flitting between cities, always one step ahead, always calculating. But as the years wore on, the weight of his decisions began to sink in. His life of exile had become a slow, grinding march toward an inevitable dead end. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many false identities he assumed, the ghosts of his past never left him. The FBI, The mob, even his former allies, all were closing in, and there was no escape this time. It wasn't just the authorities who haunted him. Lansky's mind, once razor-sharp, had become clouded with paranoia and regret. He no longer trusted anyone, not his old contacts, not the allies who had helped him build his empire, and certainly not the men who had once revered him. He had built an empire on fear and loyalty, but in the end, it was betrayal that left him trapped in a world of his own making. His empire had crumbled long ago, and now, all that remained was the hollow shell of a man who once ruled with an iron fist. The luxurious homes he had once inhabited felt like prisons. Each hideout, each new city, was just another cage. His health was deteriorating, a consequence of the years spent living on the run, constantly looking over his shoulder, never able to relax. His once sharp mind had dulled under the strain of endless fear and loneliness. He spent his days in solitude, reflecting on a life he could no longer escape. The past, with all its bloodshed and ambition, seemed to stretch out before him like a highway leading nowhere. Lansky had always been a man of power, a man who knew how to bend the world to his will. But now, in the twilight of his life, he had become a prisoner of his own creation. There was no longer any thrill in the game, no satisfaction in outsmarting his pursuers. He had reached the end of the line, a man whose every move had once been deliberate, but who now existed in a world of uncertainty. His health deteriorated, and he felt the weight of every decision he had ever made. The future he had once planned, the empire he had dreamed of leaving behind, was nothing more than a series of fading memories, slipping away like sand through his fingers. As he sat alone in a small, cramped apartment in Tel Aviv, his thoughts turned to the past, to the empire he had built and the men he had crossed. The life he had known, glamorous, dangerous, and thrilling, had long since disappeared, leaving only emptiness in its wake. The hunt for Lansky, once a thrilling game of cat and mouse, had now become a relentless pursuit, one that seemed destined to end in a place he couldn't escape from, even if he tried. And so, in the end, he sat alone in the silence, a man haunted by his own legacy, trapped in the dead end of his own making. The years in exile were not kind to Meyer Lansky. His name still carried weight, a whisper that could make men tremble, but the power he once wielded had long since faded. He had traded the glittering lights of Las Vegas for the quiet, lonely streets of Tel Aviv. Here, he was a man of shadows, someone who once controlled entire empires, now reduced to hiding behind curtains and closed doors. The wealth he had once amassed, the empire he had carefully constructed, seemed a distant memory now. But even in the twilight of his life, Lansky was never one to give up entirely. The old world was gone, replaced by a new, more dangerous one. But Lansky had survived worse. He knew how to adapt, how to stay hidden in plain sight. He spent his days navigating a quiet life in exile, careful not to draw attention. The connections he once had, the men who owed him loyalty, were scattered across the world, but they were ghosts now. The law had caught up with them, one by one, and so had his enemies. But Lansky was always a step ahead, always calculating, always plotting his next move. In the isolation of his exile, Lansky turned to what he knew best: money. The world had changed, but the old tricks still worked. He sought out new opportunities, new businesses to invest in, careful not to touch anything that could draw the attention of the authorities. He moved cautiously, choosing his partners wisely, keeping his distance from the old world that had once embraced him. He had learned the hard way that trust was a rare commodity, and even more so when you were hiding from the law. He began to rebuild his wealth, bit by bit, but it was never the same. The thrill was gone, replaced by a quiet desperation to stay one step ahead of those who still sought him. He no longer had the power to control cities or dictate terms to politicians. Instead, he lived in the margins, quietly accumulating what he could without risking exposure. But with each passing day, the weight of his past grew heavier. The old connections, the bloodshed, the betrayals, Lansky could never escape them. They followed him, like shadows that never faded. Every so often, a familiar face would surface, a reminder of a life he could never return to. These fleeting encounters were always tinged with regret, as if the world he had built was slipping away from him piece by piece. But Lansky remained resolute. He had always been a survivor. Even now, in the years of his exile, he was still calculating, still plotting, still seeking to rebuild the empire he had lost. The law may have hunted him, but Lansky was not done yet. The distance between Meyer Lansky and his family had always been a delicate balance, a line he had walked carefully, ensuring they never saw too much, but still felt the luxury and protection his wealth could provide. For decades, his wife, sons, and daughter had lived in the shadows of his empire, enjoying the fruits of his success without ever fully knowing the darkness that fueled it. But as time passed, cracks began to form in that carefully constructed world. Lansky's past, once a source of pride, began to weigh heavily on him, and as the years wore on, the cost of his decisions became impossible to ignore. The constant fear of arrest, the shifting allegiances, the betrayals, all of it began to erode the relationships that had once seemed so secure. His children, grown and increasingly aware of the world they lived in, started to question the price of their father's success. They saw the toll it took on him, on them. His son's eyes, once full of admiration, now turned colder, more distant, as the reality of his father's criminal past became impossible to deny. It wasn't just the law that was closing in. It was the people closest to him. His wife, who had spent years turning a blind eye to the source of his wealth, began to withdraw. The late-night calls, the constant stream of strangers, the fear in his eyes when he returned home, all of it slowly poisoned the life they had built. Their once solid foundation cracked under the weight of his criminal legacy. In moments of quiet, his wife would stare out the window, her face drawn, the silence between them growing longer. She knew the cost of being his partner, but even she couldn't escape the feeling that the empire he had built was crumbling around them. The children, too, started to distance themselves. They had lived with the understanding that their father's world was one of power, wealth, and respect. But as the years passed and the consequences of his actions began to materialize, the moral cost became undeniable. Their father, once their hero, became a man to fear, a man whose name carried both reverence and shame in equal measure. In private conversations, his children would question the choices that had been made for them, the legacy they were bound to inherit. And so, one by one, they began to retreat. Slowly at first, with subtle glances and whispered words, but it grew. Their distance was a quiet betrayal, one Lansky could feel like the tightening of a noose. They had been his pride, the reason he had sacrificed so much. But in the end, it was his actions that tore them from him. His family, his closest allies, turned away. They couldn't live under the shadow of the man he had become, and Lansky, for the first time in his life, was left to confront the emptiness of the empire he had built alone. As the years slipped by, Meyer Lansky found himself on the outskirts of the world he had once ruled with an iron grip. The empire he had carefully constructed, the network of casinos, the vast money-laundering operations, the power behind the scenes was slipping through his fingers like sand. The phone calls that once held weight, that demanded attention, now came less frequently, and when they did, they were laced with distance. His power had waned, his influence eroded by time, and the very men who had once depended on him were now looking for someone else to guide them. Lansky's mind, sharp as ever, couldn't ignore the truth. His empire was collapsing, and with it, his place within the mob. He watched as new, younger men climbed the ranks, their loyalty rooted in ambition rather than history. The old alliances that had once been the foundation of his power were dissolving, leaving him behind in a world that no longer seemed to want him. He had been the financial genius, the one who kept the books and balanced the bloodshed with cold, hard numbers. But now, even that felt like a distant memory, a job for a different era, a different breed of man. The mob, as it always did, was shifting, evolving. What had once been a brotherhood was now a fragmented collection of rival factions, each maneuvering for control, each more desperate than the last. Lansky found himself watching from the sidelines, his name no longer spoken with the respect it once commanded. There were whispers of his past, rumors of his wealth being drained, of his influence being diminished. Even the men who had sworn loyalty to him were growing distant, their focus turning inward, to their own survival rather than the greater cause that Lansky had so meticulously fostered. But the greatest loss was yet to come, the loss of his family. His sons, his wife, the very people he had once sacrificed everything for, had finally begun to abandon him. The isolation became unbearable. He had spent decades building an empire, carving out a place for his loved ones in a world of danger and violence, only to have it all slip away, piece by piece. The wealth, the power, the respect, they were nothing without the family he had worked so hard to protect. And in the end, they too had turned their backs on him. They couldn't live with the man he had become, the man whose every decision had been shaped by fear and survival. Alone now, with nothing but his dwindling fortune and the ghosts of his past, Lansky understood the final betrayal. It wasn't the loss of his empire, nor the fading of his power. It was the realization that the price he had paid to be the man who built it all was everything, and in the quiet that followed, all that was left was the bitter truth. In his pursuit of dominance, he had lost everything that truly mattered. Meyer Lansky sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, his hands shaking slightly as he poured himself a drink, the ice clinking in the glass like the echoes of his past. The years had worn him down, not just physically, but in ways deeper than his skin could show. He thought of the men he had trusted, the ones who had sworn their loyalty to him, only to turn their backs when the tide shifted. For all the wealth, all the power, it was the betrayals that cut deepest. Loyalty, he had once believed, was the bedrock of his empire. The men who worked for him, the ones he called friends, had stood by him through thick and thin, knowing that their loyalty would be rewarded. It had been a simple equation in his mind. Loyalty earned rewards, betrayal brought swift retribution. But as the years passed, and as the shadows of his past grew longer, Lansky had begun to question if loyalty was ever truly about honor, or if it was just a tool wielded by the strong to control the weak. The blood spilled in the streets, the bodies that piled up in the wake of his decisions, had all been in the name of loyalty. Men had died because they had stayed true to him, and others had died because they had chosen to betray him. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. He had built his empire on the backs of those who would follow him without question. But in the end, it wasn't loyalty that had kept him afloat. It was fear. Fear that kept men from crossing him. Fear that kept the streets quiet when his name was spoken. But fear, Lansky knew, was a fragile thing. It could break. The whispers of betrayal had reached him long before the knives were drawn. He had seen the signs, his trusted men starting to look away, their eyes searching for something he could no longer offer them. Power, respect, security, all things that he had once been able to provide, but now were slipping from his grasp. Loyalty had been a tool, a weapon to keep men in line, but it had always come at a cost. Those who had been loyal to him had paid their dues in blood. They had lived by the code, only to see their lives torn apart when the world shifted beneath their feet. And Lansky, ever the businessman, had come to understand that loyalty, like everything else, had its price. As the years wore on, he realized that in the end, Loyalty didn't matter. It was fleeting, like a fleeting glimpse of something beautiful that disappeared before you could touch it. Betrayal, on the other hand, was permanent. It stuck to your soul, left its mark like a scar that never healed. Lansky had been loyal to the mob, to his friends, to his family. But in the end, what did it matter? In the end, loyalty had betrayed him. And now, sitting in the silence of his own isolation, he could only reflect on the price he had paid for it all. The days had started to blur together for Meyer Lansky. Time, once something he could manipulate, now moved with a pace he couldn't control. The rhythm of his life, which had once been dictated by the ebb and flow of money, power, and betrayal, was now drowned in the silent whispers of mortality. His health had deteriorated, a cruel reminder of the cost of a life spent in shadows. The hands that once held the strings of empires now trembled, unable to grasp the fleeting moments of time left to him. Lansky could no longer ignore the reality that his body, much like his empire, was slowly crumbling. His breath was shallow. Each step he took felt heavier, like the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. The scars of his life, both physical and emotional, ached with a constant, nagging pain. He had lived by the idea that power was everything, that it could buy him time, buy him loyalty, buy him escape. But as his body betrayed him, he found himself staring at the truth. Nothing could outrun time, not even a life built on fear and riches. He sat by the window, staring out at the city that had once been his playground. The world had changed, but it still felt eerily familiar. Las Vegas, Cuba, New York. His fingerprints were all over it. Yet, as he gazed at the streets, the neon lights and the hustle, he realized it was no longer his world. The streets didn't whisper his name with the same reverence. His influence had faded like the smoke from a long-forgotten cigar. The men who had once bowed to him now moved in shadows of their own, looking over their shoulders as they climbed the same ladders he had once climbed. Lansky had spent years carefully crafting his escape from the past, but now, in the quiet moments of his decline, he found himself haunted by the very things he thought he could leave behind. The faces of those who had betrayed him, the bodies he had ordered into the ground, and the countless deals that had built his empire. All of it swirled in his mind, like a fever dream he could no longer escape. He had built his legacy with blood, but now he realized it was a price he would never be free of. In the solitude of his final years, Lansky couldn't help but wonder if there was any redemption left for him. But redemption, like power, had slipped from his grasp. He had spent so much time controlling everything around him, but now he faced the one thing he could not control: the end. It was no longer a question of how he would go, but when. As he sat in the quiet, his body failing him, he knew one thing for sure: his last dance had begun. And this time, there would be no escape, no negotiation, no second chances. Meyer Lansky knew the end was near. It had been creeping up on him for years, a slow tightening of the noose that he couldn't outrun. No matter how many safe houses he moved between, no matter how many identities he wore, the authorities had never truly stopped looking for him, and now, in the quiet of his exile, he could feel them drawing closer. He had lived a life built on deception, manipulation, and survival. But even he understood that there was no escape from the inevitable. His body was no longer the machine it once was. The years of a hard life, of stress, of constant running, had caught up with him in ways that even money couldn't solve. The past, with all its blood and betrayal, seemed to press on him with each passing day. His health had been in decline for some time, and now, each breath felt like a struggle. Each movement was a reminder of how far he had fallen from the man who once ruled empires of crime with a quiet, calculating hand. The world around him had changed, too. Gone were the days of power and influence, the nights spent in luxurious casinos and palatial estates. In their place was a life of solitude and fear. His family had turned away from him, his name nothing more than a whispered legend, a faded memory of a bygone era. There were no more phone calls with associates, no more quiet deals to be made in the shadows. The world he had built, the empire of wealth and violence, had collapsed like a house of cards. But what gnawed at him the most in those final days was the creeping knowledge that he had nowhere left to run. The authorities, the government agents, had been relentless in their pursuit of him, never forgetting the man who had once been a kingpin of organized crime. They had tried time and again to bring him to justice, but Lansky had always managed to slip away, his financial cunning keeping him one step ahead. Now, it seemed, they were closing in for good. He could feel it in the air, something had shifted. The quiet whispers of law enforcement, the tightening of the noose around his neck, it was all too clear. He had outrun the law for years, but he knew that no one was invincible, not even him. The final chapter of his story was approaching, and this time, there would be no escape. Lansky spent those last days reflecting on his life, on the choices that had brought him to this point. There were no more games to be played, no more deals to be struck. Just the cold certainty of a life lived in the shadows, a life that was about to come to its final, irreversible conclusion. As the law prepared for one last attempt to capture him, Lansky could only wait. Meyer Lansky's death came quietly, almost as if he had been waiting for it. A final chapter closing on a life he could no longer escape. For a man who had spent his life buried beneath layers of lies, deals, and violence, there was an eerie calm in his passing. He was no longer the mastermind behind the sprawling syndicates, no longer the shadow who had moved nations, controlled cities, or outsmarted his enemies. The empire he built from blood and money had crumbled, and with it, so did the man who had once been at its heart. As Lansky's life slipped away, the legacy of his deeds began to settle into the cracks of history, like dust on old books. He had been a master of numbers, of finance, of laundering money with such precision that it was almost an art. But what he had built was not simply a network of wealth, it was a web of violence, betrayal, and bloodshed. The money flowed like water, but it had been soaked in the sins of men he had either ordered dead or watched disappear into the shadows. Lansky's hands had never been stained with blood directly, yet they had orchestrated so much death. He understood the business of killing, the cold calculus of who needed to be removed, and why. But as he lay in his final days, all that remained was a man who had long ago sacrificed his humanity for survival. He was a shadow of his former self, a man who had traded loyalty for fear, and in the end, even that fear had begun to slip away. By the time he died, his connections had withered. The people he had trusted, once close allies, had either betrayed him or faded into irrelevance. His family, once a source of quiet solace, had long distanced themselves from him. In the end, all he had left was the same cold reality that had always defined him, a man who lived in the shadows, who used others to build his empire, but had never truly built anything for himself. The world outside moved on, indifferent to the passing of a man who had once been a king in his own right. The casinos he had helped shape in Vegas, the empire of crime that had thrived under his watch, they were now mere echoes of a bygone age. The money, too, had faded, scattered across foreign accounts and paper trails long buried. It was all gone, slipping like sand through the fingers of time. And yet, his name lived on, not as a hero, nor as a villain, but as a symbol of the cost of ambition, of power won through violence, and of an empire built on the backs of men who had paid the ultimate price. Lansky's death was the end of an era, but the legacy of the man who had played the numbers game better than anyone would linger for years to come. Not in headlines or history books, but in whispered conversations and shadowed corners, where stories of the mob would continue to be told, long after the final numbers were counted. In the years that followed Meyer Lansky's death, the shadows of his empire slowly receded, but the mob's legacy lingered, stubborn and unyielding. The world that Lansky had helped shape didn't simply vanish. Instead, it morphed, grew into something else more fragmented, more covert, but no less dangerous. Those who had once stood beside him, the men who had filled the seats at the tables of power he had orchestrated, found themselves on the wrong side of the law. The inevitable happened. They were caught. The trials were nothing short of a spectacle. The press, eager for the next chapter in the ongoing saga of organized crime, turned the courtroom into a battleground for the public's fascination with the men who had once controlled cities, coastlines, and casinos. But this wasn't just any trial. These were the mobsters who had risen from the same streets as Lansky, some of them direct disciples, others opportunists who had learned the ways of the underworld in the shadows of his empire. They were now facing the consequences of decades of crimes that were as ruthless as they were vast. Vito Genovese, once a close ally and rival to Lansky, found himself caught in a tangled web of charges, racketeering, extortion, and a string of murders that stretched back decades. His trial was the centerpiece, the world watching as the kingpins of old fell one by one. There was no denying the extent of his criminal enterprise. The charges were so severe, the evidence so overwhelming, that it seemed only a matter of time before justice would catch up with him. Yet, there was a certain dignity in the way these men faced the inevitable, as if they knew they had always been playing a game where the rules were never meant to favor them. As the years dragged on, others like John Gotti, the so-called Teflon Don, would rise in prominence. Gotti's name became synonymous with the mob's power in New York, but he too would eventually be caught in the snare of law enforcement, his trials lasting for years. It was a reminder that the world Lansky had built was still very much alive, but no longer invincible. The mob had always thrived in its ability to remain hidden in plain sight, to operate just on the edge of the law. But now, the walls were closing in, one conviction at a time. And as these trials unfolded, one after another, the inevitable became clear. The mob's reign, once so absolute, was slowly crumbling under the weight of modern law enforcement. The same tactics that had once kept them safe, intimidation, bribery, and silence, were losing their power in a world that had become increasingly connected and sophisticated. The men who had once controlled the streets with a flick of a hand or a whispered order now found themselves in a courtroom, vulnerable and exposed. Lansky's legacy, for all its ruthlessness, became a symbol of what was slipping away. The old guard of the mob was being replaced, but not with the same power, not with the same respect. The trials of these men, in the end, weren't just a reckoning for their individual crimes. They were the final judgment on the empire that Meyer Lansky had helped create, a world that had once seemed invincible, but was now nothing more than a fading relic. After Meyer Lansky's death, the world he had once controlled with calculating precision began to shift. The empire he had built on the bones of the old world of organized crime was left fragmented, but not for long. In the vacuum he left behind, new players rose, eager to claim the space once dominated by Lansky and his generation of mobsters. These new syndicates didn't inherit Lansky's empire directly, but they absorbed the essence of it, the ruthlessness, the drive for power, and the cold, calculated approach to making money. The days of the old-school gangsters were numbered. The larger-than-life figures who had run casinos, drug routes, and extortion rackets now seemed to be relics from another time. The landscape of organized crime was shifting, becoming less visible, more dispersed. But the hunger for control, for wealth, remained as strong as ever. New syndicates, often more elusive and savvy in the ways of technology, began to fill the power vacuum Lansky left in his wake. They weren't as flamboyant as their predecessors, but they were just as dangerous. The 1,000, 980s, and 1990s saw the rise of several new players, many of them with ties to the old guard, but with a better understanding of how the modern world worked. These were groups that understood how to blend in, how to use the tools of the corporate world to their advantage. They had no need for the gun-toting showdowns or the flashy casinos of old. Instead, they relied on networks, computers, and high-level corruption that could quietly influence politicians, law enforcement, and the financial systems that controlled the world. While the old mobsters had been masters of extortion and bootlegging, the new breed of syndicates were no longer confined to such narrow arenas. They moved vast sums of money through legitimate businesses and laundromats, shifting assets in ways that would have made Lansky proud. The skills he had mastered in making illicit wealth blend seamlessly into the world of legitimate finance, became the foundation for these new organizations. These groups knew how to stay under the radar, knowing full well that in the age of surveillance and global communication, the key was to operate without being seen, to infiltrate systems rather than challenge them head-on. At the same time, there were those who looked back to the days of Lansky's influence in Las Vegas, gambling, and the showbiz underworld. Smaller but no less violent, these factions capitalized on the entertainment industries, using sports betting, pornography, and street-level crime to further their reach. While they weren't on the scale of the old syndicates, their influence grew with time, manipulating everything from street corners to high-stakes poker tables. And so, with the death of one giant, the seeds were planted for a new generation of organized crime. These syndicates didn't just thrive in the shadows, they defined them, manipulating a world that had become more complex, more hidden, and yet, just as dangerous as the one Lansky had known. They learned from the mistakes of the past but held on to the essential truths: power, money, and fear. Meyer Lansky's name, once whispered in the back rooms of speakeasies and smoky casinos, began to echo louder in the public consciousness after his death. The underworld that had given him his power, so secretive, so dangerous, began to be washed with a veneer of myth, a gloss of glamour that made it irresistible for the mainstream. Hollywood, always eager for stories that blended danger with allure, found in Lansky a character that was both tragic and mesmerizing. Soon, the man who had carefully hidden behind the shadows of organized crime became a larger-than-life figure in American pop culture. The world of Lansky, the gambling mogul, the financial genius behind the mob, was no longer seen as grim and violent. Instead, it was polished and cinematic. Hollywood and the media, with their thirst for drama, found in his life an irresistible mix of power, wealth, betrayal, and redemption. His story was told with grandeur, the camera lingering on the opulence of his empire, the smoke-filled rooms where deals were made with nothing more than a handshake. The man who once kept a ledger of murderers and dirty money became a folk hero to many, even as he had once been a villain. The documentaries, films, and books that followed didn't just tell the story of Lansky's criminal genius. They romanticized it. His intelligence, his cold efficiency, and his ability to control vast amounts of money were portrayed as the hallmarks of a misunderstood man. Writers and filmmakers, using the dramatic license of fiction, created a hero out of the very qualities that had made him dangerous. In this sanitized version of his life, Lansky was no longer the man who helped orchestrate the deaths of his enemies. Instead, he became a charming, conflicted figure who played a part in the rise of the American underworld, even as he walked a tightrope between the worlds of law and crime. Films like The Godfather and later documentaries about mob life fed into this myth, turning Lansky and others like him into the stuff of legend. His relationship with Lucky Luciano, his rise from a streetwise kid to the financial mastermind of the mob, all became pieces of the grand narrative of organized crime's golden age. Hollywood turned the murky world of gambling and racketeering into something more palatable. packaging it in the glitter of the American dream gone wrong. The reality of Lansky's life, the betrayals, the murders, the constant threat of death was often lost in the glamorization of it all. He was no longer a cold-blooded mastermind hiding from the law. Instead, he was a tragic anti-hero, a victim of circumstance who, despite his flaws, had built an empire that touched the very core of American society. In the end, Lansky was immortalized not for the crimes he committed, but for the persona he became, an icon of power and consequence. The Hollywood effect had done its work, turning the man who had once moved silently in the shadows into a legend for the ages, one that continues to be romanticized in films and TV shows, keeping his name alive long after his final days in exile. Meyer Lansky's legacy didn't die with him. Even as the decades passed and the man himself became a ghost, his empire lingered in the shadows, an indelible mark on the underworld that still echoed through the lives of those who followed in his footsteps. The younger generations of criminals, those born into the chaos of the streets or brought in by the lure of easy money, studied his rise and fall with a sense of reverence, not for his ruthlessness, but for his intellect. Lansky, despite his violent past, was seen by many as the epitome of control, an architect of empires built not on brute force, but on financial cunning and calculated risk. The young, ambitious mobsters looked up to him not as a figure of violence, but as a blueprint for how to run things quietly, efficiently, and with an eye on the long game. They learned from his ability to launder money, his knack for getting into legitimate businesses while maintaining control of the illicit side, and his remarkable talent for staying just one step ahead of both his enemies and the law. They learned that it wasn't enough to break the rules. To thrive in the underworld, one needed to write the rules themselves. The reverence for Lansky's style of leadership wasn't just limited to criminals. In the world of organized crime, he had become a figure to study, a case of brilliant strategy mixed with an unyielding will to survive. From the casinos in Las Vegas to the streets of New York, his methods were seen as the foundation on which modern crime syndicates were built. His subtlety, his ability to work from the shadows without drawing attention, had become a model for the next wave of mobsters who sought to blend into society while reaping its rewards. But even in the years that followed his death, Lansky's name was still whispered, often in connection to the rise and fall of new syndicates that sought to replicate his success. The newer, younger generations of criminals didn't necessarily revere the man himself, but they studied the legacy he left behind. They picked up where he had left off, navigating the tricky world of finance, politics, and organized crime with the same cold logic Lansky had once wielded so expertly. His influence seeped into their operations, and his tactics became the textbook for how to build a criminal empire that could stand the test of time. But the ghost of Lansky wasn't just confined to the world of organized crime. His story, his triumphs, and his downfall were retold time and time again in documentaries, films, and books. To the public, his name was still synonymous with the rise of organized crime in America, a symbol of the darker side of the American dream. His life was dissected and discussed in the classrooms of criminal justice courses, where his strategic mind and financial brilliance were dissected like a blueprint for success. In the end, Lansky's legacy lived on not through the crimes he committed, but through the blueprint he left for others to follow, one that combined fear, ambition, and a keen understanding of how the world truly worked. Even as he faded into history, the ghost of Lansky remained, a silent force in the world of organized crime, influencing the next generation of criminals who still sought the empire he had built from nothing. Meyer Lansky's influence on the world of organized crime continued long after his death, a quiet but unshakable presence that shaped how criminal empires were built and maintained in the decades that followed. His methods were not just lessons learned, they were commandments etched into the fabric of the underworld, passed down to each new generation that sought to follow in his footsteps. Lansky had understood something fundamental that others missed. Power in the criminal world was not about brute force or bloodshed. It was about control, subtlety, and most importantly, the numbers. His ability to stay in the shadows, to avoid drawing attention while building a sprawling empire, became the gold standard for the new breed of criminals. Where others made their mark with flashy displays of violence, Lansky thrived in the background, pulling strings and moving money with the precision of a master accountant. He understood that true power wasn't found in the gunfire, but in the ability to operate without detection, to control systems that others thought they could not touch. For decades, aspiring mobsters studied Lansky's playbook, learning how to navigate the complex world of money laundering, political connections, and the delicate dance between legality and criminality. His financial acumen became legendary, turning illicit gains into legitimate profits with an ease that left others in awe. To this day, his financial strategies are still studied, not just by those in the criminal world, but by anyone who seeks to understand the mechanics of power. He knew how to make money multiply, how to get out of a bind with minimal damage, and most of all, how to keep the books clean and the authorities in the dark. The younger generation of criminals took his blueprint and adapted it for the modern world, where technology and global connections made his strategies even more effective. Where Lansky had to rely on carefully constructed networks of trust, they now had encryption and digital anonymity at their fingertips. Yet, despite the changing landscape, his core principles remained the same. Build your empire quietly, keep your enemies close, and never let your name get too dirty. His ability to shift between the legal and the illegal seamlessly taught them that the two worlds could coexist, as long as you were smart enough to know how to operate in both. Lansky's legacy was not just in the casinos, the rackets, or the millions he made, but in the quiet, calculating way he reshaped the criminal landscape. His influence was everywhere, in the way modern criminal syndicates ran their operations, in the way business was done from the shadows. His lessons were simple but effective. Never get caught, never get greedy, and always make sure you're the one controlling the flow of money. Even in the face of law enforcement's constant pursuit, his methods proved resilient. Criminals worldwide understood that Lansky's way, the quiet, methodical approach to crime, was the only one that had the chance to stand the test of time. The world had changed, but his influence remained undiminished, a quiet echo in the lives of those who sought to follow his path. The government's pursuit of Meyer Lansky's empire never truly ended with his death. Though his criminal network had fractured, its remnants scattered, and his influence waned in the face of law enforcement's relentless pressure, the shadow of his empire continued to linger. Lansky had lived a life built on secrets, on channels of wealth that stretched beyond the reach of even the most sophisticated investigators. For years, the authorities tried to follow the trail he had left behind, clues buried in offshore accounts, questionable businesses, and laundered money that had slipped through every net they cast. The United States government, frustrated by its inability to bring Lansky to full justice, shifted its focus to dismantling the legacy he had so carefully crafted. There were rumors that Lansky had stashed away vast sums of money in foreign banks, hidden from the prying eyes of the IRS, tucked into corners of the world where the long arm of the law could never quite reach. These rumors fueled the relentless pursuit. They dug through his past with a fine-tooth comb, hoping to uncover the last of his financial treasures, thinking that if they could just get to the root, they might cut down the entire empire he had built. But Lansky had always been several steps ahead. He was the king of cover-ups, the master of deception, and even in death, his web of financial dealings was a labyrinth that defied the best efforts of the law. The United States government, not one to relent easily, enlisted international allies, hoping to uncover the funds hidden in Switzerland, Panama, and the Bahamas. Investigators followed every whisper, tracked down every lead, but the money seemed to evaporate, always just out of their grasp. As far as they could tell, Lansky had vanished with his wealth, leaving only fragmented traces behind. The final reckoning, it seemed, would be elusive. For the mob's remaining players, those who had been loyal to Lansky and kept his methods alive, the government's continued pursuit was a reminder of the price of loyalty. They had been taught well by the master of financial maneuvering, but even they could not escape the eventual consequences. Lansky's heirs, whether by blood or by the business, found themselves haunted by the same ghosts that had pursued him in life. The empire they inherited was riddled with holes, marked by legal pressures, and weighed down by the constant threat of exposure. Yet, still, they kept quiet, trying to hold on to the remnants of what Lansky had built. For years after his death, investigations continued, occasionally reopening old wounds, each effort a stark reminder of how far-reaching Lansky's influence had been, and how deeply it was entrenched in the underworld. His empire had been more than just a collection of criminals. It was a system, a force that operated with a quiet efficiency that left a legacy the government could never fully erase. And so, the pursuit of Meyer Lansky's hidden wealth, the last of his empire, became its own twisted game, one that continued to haunt those who sought justice and those who sought to keep his empire alive. The myth of Meyer Lansky grew like a living thing, fed by the years, by whispers and legends, by the stories that were told and retold long after his death. He was no longer just a man, a criminal mastermind who had carved out an empire built on blood and money. He became a symbol, an embodiment of the very essence of organized crime, a figure whose shadow stretched across decades, whose name was spoken with equal parts reverence and fear. For those who knew him, the myth was rooted in truth, but even they couldn't help but become part of the narrative they helped to build. Lansky was the man who made it all work, the financial genius behind the mob, the one who understood how to move money, hide wealth, and build a global network that spanned countries and continents. He wasn't just the accountant, he was the brains, the man who always stayed in the shadows but never let anyone forget that it was his mind that made the machinery run. But the story didn't stop there. Over time, the myth took on a life of its own, growing larger than the man who had created it. As the years passed, Hollywood and pop culture latched onto Lansky's story, as they did with so many figures of the mob's golden era. Films, documentaries, and television series painted him as the wise, calculating figure, the cold-blooded mastermind who understood the game better than anyone. He became a character in a crime saga, larger than life, someone whose decisions rippled through the underworld like a slow-moving storm. His cool demeanor, his quiet authority, and his ability to stay one step ahead of the law and his enemies made him the perfect subject for the silver screen. But the myth wasn't confined to Hollywood. In the streets, in the bars, in the back rooms of smoky casinos, people continued to tell his story. Some told it with a kind of reverence, seeing him as a hero of sorts, the one who had outsmarted the system, who had taken on the government and lived to tell the tale. Others spoke of him with fear, acknowledging that his reach had been so vast, so deep, that it seemed no one could escape the web he had woven. For many, Lansky was the perfect example of how far loyalty, cunning, and ruthless ambition could take a man. As time marched on, the myth evolved. New generations, born long after the height of Lansky's power, came to know his name not through personal experience, but through the stories passed down by older generations, through the media, through the legends that had grown around him. He became an icon of the past, an enduring symbol of the mob's golden age, even as the world around him changed. The myth of Meyer Lansky had outlived the man. It had become its own entity, transcending the life of the man who had created it, a testament to the enduring power of legend. And in that myth, Lansky would live forever not as a man, but as a symbol of everything the world had come to associate with the mob: wealth, power, secrecy, and the ultimate price of loyalty. As the years passed, Meyer Lansky's empire slowly slipped into the shadows, as though it had never existed. The world that had once revolved around his intricate web of gambling, money laundering, and mob influence grew quieter with each passing decade. Lansky, the man who had shaped an entire criminal underworld, faded from the headlines, becoming nothing more than a whispered memory. His name no longer sent a chill down the spine of politicians or lawmen. It was just another piece of history, tucked away in dusty files and forgotten stories. Time, as it does, eroded even the strongest empires, and Lansky's was no exception. His grip on Las Vegas, his ties to the Cuban government, his financial maneuvers that had once seemed so indestructible, all began to dissolve. New players emerged, and old ones fell from grace. The mafia, which had once been unified under the guise of syndicates, fractured. Power shifted from the hands of the older generation to those less capable, less calculating. The criminal empire Lansky had carefully constructed with his mind, his wealth, and his subtle hand began to crumble under the weight of its own decay. The world changed around him, and with it, the echoes of Lansky's influence grew quieter. By the time he passed away, Meyer Lansky was little more than a relic of a bygone era. The stories, the power, the fear, all of it had faded into a haze of forgotten names. His legacy, once immortalized in the actions of those he mentored and the empire he built, seemed to disintegrate almost as quickly as he had left it behind. The next generations, with their own battles, their own ambitions, no longer looked to the old gangster legends for guidance. Lansky, the master of numbers and crime, was now just a chapter in history books, a footnote in the story of the mob. And yet, in some corners, his death was met with a strange sense of finality, not from the mob or from law enforcement, but from the world that had never fully understood him. People had once feared the shadow he cast, the empire he had built from nothing, but now they simply let him go, as one might release an old, forgotten book from a shelf. There were no grand memorials, no statues erected in his honor, no legends built around his grave. Meyer Lansky's death, both the quiet passing of a man and the slow extinction of his influence, marked the end of an era, one in which empires rose on the strength of cunning, and the world whispered about the men who lived outside the law. It was a death, not of the body, but of a legacy. Slowly, his name dissolved from the public eye, as the noise of the world around him continued to roar, oblivious to the shadow that had once loomed so large. Meyer Lansky's life was an intricate dance between shadow and light, a life lived in the margins where the law and morality often blurred into something unrecognizable. As the years wore on, and the man himself faded into the anonymity of exile, it became clear that his legacy wasn't just built on the empire he had created or the wealth he'd amassed, but on the myth he had carefully constructed. He had always been a ghost, even when alive, a figure lurking in the background, too powerful to confront directly, too elusive to capture. Looking back, Lansky's life was a mosaic of ruthlessness, genius, and quiet introspection. For a man who had ordered countless hits, manipulated governments, and stolen from the very fabric of society, it's almost ironic that he was remembered as a quiet figure, a man who operated behind the scenes. The bloodshed he left behind was more than just a tally of bodies. It was the price of a world he had created, one in which loyalty was bought and sold, and where everyone was expendable. The body count that followed him through his career was staggering, yet even as the names piled up, victims of betrayal, enemies vanquished, and those who crossed the line, Lansky never seemed to feel the weight of it all. He was a survivor, always calculating, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Perhaps it was his cold, logical mind that kept him from letting the violence overwhelm him. Or perhaps it was simply that, for men like him, bloodshed was just another part of business. But, in the end, the people whose lives had been taken in the name of power and money seemed to matter less than the legacy he left behind. That legacy, like the man himself, was complicated. It wasn't just the casinos or the fortune he had once commanded. It wasn't even the corrupt politicians or the criminals he had used as pawns in his grand game. The true measure of Lansky's legacy lay in the myth that continued to haunt the world long after his death. The legend of the quiet mastermind, the accountant who could make a fortune disappear with a flick of his pen, was something that couldn't be erased. It lived on in books, films, documentaries, and in the whispered stories of those who had known him or thought they had. In his final years, Lansky had been just another man on the run, hiding in plain sight, evading capture like so many before him. But his myth never stopped chasing him. Even as the world moved on, even as new syndicates rose and new crime lords came to power, the ghost of Lansky lingered. He was a cautionary tale, a symbol of the costs of ambition and the price of betrayal. And perhaps that, more than anything else, was the true victory of his life, a myth that would live forever, outlasting the man who had once breathed life into it. As Lansky lay in the quiet of his final days, the world outside continued to churn, unaware of the final breath of a man who had shaped its underworld. He slept, and in his sleep, his empire rested with him, fading into the silence of time. But the myth remained, a lingering shadow, a reminder of the price of power and the price of survival.